Hey guys, welcome back. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Whether you're already tucked into bed, curled up on the couch, or just settling in after a long day, I'm really happy you chose to spend this time here. Welcome back to Sleep History with Sikandar. Tonight I want to take you somewhere specific. I want you to imagine standing on a London street sometime in the 1840s. It's early evening. The gas lamps have just been lit one by a man with a long pole who moves down the street like a quiet ghost. The fog is coming in. Not the dramatic, swirling fog of a Gothic novel, but that soft, grey, damp kind that settles over the city like a wool blanket. The kind that blurs the edges of everything. You can hear the faint rattle of a carriage somewhere nearby, the clip of hooves on wet cobblestones, a door opening and closing, and if you listen carefully, beneath all of that, something else. The low hum of a city that runs almost entirely on one invisible currency. Not money, not power, not titles or land or inheritance, reputation. That single word shaped more lives, ended more futures, and decided more fates in Victorian England than almost any law ever written. And here is the thing that I want us to sit with tonight. That word did not mean the same thing for everyone. For a man, a damaged reputation was a bruise, something that ached for a while, maybe left a mark but healed. Sometimes it even made him more interesting, more dangerous, more attractive. For a woman, a damaged reputation was a death sentence. Not a physical one, not always, but a social one, a financial one, an emotional one, the kind of death where you are still breathing, still walking, still existing in the world, but the world has decided you no longer count. Think about that for a moment. Same society, same scandal, two completely different outcomes, depending on nothing more than whether you happen to be born a man or a woman. That is what tonight's story is about. Now, before we step fully into this world, if this kind of storytelling is something that makes your evenings a little gentler and a little richer, it would mean so much to me if you hit that subscribe button and left a like. It really does help more than you might think. And hey, drop a comment down below. Tell me where you're listening from tonight. What time is it where you are? I always love reading those. All right. Now, dim those lights if you can. Let the room get a little quieter. Let the phone screen go dark. If you've got a blanket nearby, pull it up. Get comfortable. Because we are about to step back into a world where a whispered rumour could do more damage than a loaded pistol, and where the rules of survival were written in invisible ink that only half the population was allowed to read. Let's begin. Picture a London drawing room. Not a grand one, not tonight. Something more modest. The home of a respectable middle-class family, the kind that makes up the vast, anxious backbone of Victorian society. The room is warm. A coal fire burns low in the grate, casting that particular amber light that makes everything feel slightly older than it is. There's a clock on the mantelpiece ticking softly, a tea service on the side table, the cups already used, the pot gone cold. The curtains are drawn against the evening, heavy fabric that blocks the draught and the noise of the street outside. And in this room a conversation is happening, not a loud one, not an argument, something much more dangerous than that, a quiet conversation about someone who isn't here. Did you hear about Mrs. Barrington? That's all it takes. 6 words, a name, a question. And in a world without telephones, without social media, without any of the instant communication we take for granted today, those 6 words could travel faster than a telegram. Here is what most people don't fully understand about Victorian England. We think of it as a rigid, formal, buttoned-up society, and it was. But beneath that formality, Beneath those starched collars and carefully arranged drawing rooms, there was a social machine running at all times, and that machine was powered by information. Who was seen with whom, who was invited and who was not, who arrived at the ball and who left early, who received a calling card and who had theirs returned unopened. Every interaction was watched, every absence was noted, every detail, no matter how small, was filed away and circulated through a network of morning calls, afternoon teas, dinner parties, and whispered exchanges in the spaces between dances. This wasn't gossip. Not in the way we think of gossip now. This was intelligence. This was the operating system of an entire social world. And here's the part that I find quietly devastating. The people most vulnerable to that system, the people whose lives could be most completely destroyed by it, were the people who had the least power within it. Women. Let me set this properly because I think the scale of it matters. In the England of the 1840s, a woman's reputation was not just a social nicety. It was not just about being liked or being popular or being well thought of. It was, in the most literal and practical sense, her entire survival strategy. A respectable woman could marry. She could live in a comfortable home. She could raise children who would be accepted in society. She could walk into a shop and be served. She could attend church and be greeted. She could exist. A woman whose reputation had been damaged, even slightly, even by rumour, even by association, could lose all of that. Not gradually, not over time, overnight. One whisper, one raised eyebrow, one conspicuous absence from a guest list. That was enough. And the punishment wasn't dramatic. That's what makes it so quietly effective. Nobody dragged you into a courtyard. Nobody put you in chains. Nobody made a public spectacle of it, not at first. What happened was quieter than that. Doors simply stopped opening. Invitations stopped arriving. Friends stopped calling. The world you lived in, the only world you were allowed to live in, simply closed around you like a fist. I want you to sit with that image for a moment, because I think it matters. Now, the man sitting across that same drawing room, in the same society, playing by the same apparent rules, he lived in an entirely different reality. And that difference, that gap between what scandal meant for her and what it meant for him, is one of the most revealing, most quietly shocking things about the Victorian age. We're going to walk through that gap tonight. We're going to meet the women who fell into it. We're going to meet the men who danced along its edge and came out the other side, more celebrated than before. And we're going to understand, really understand, how an entire civilization built a system that destroyed one half of its population for the exact same behavior it rewarded in the other half. But first, we need to understand the architecture, the rules, the invisible scaffolding that held this whole world in place. And that scaffolding was built in the most ordinary of places, the parlour. It's a word we still use today, though we've mostly forgotten what it actually meant. We might picture a dusty room with uncomfortable furniture and a few framed portraits on the wall, and that's not entirely wrong. But it misses the point entirely. The parlour was the stage. It was the only room in a middle-class home that outsiders were meant to see, and everything in it, every cushion, every ornament, every carefully chosen piece of embroidery draped over the piano, was a message. It said, "We are respectable. We are proper. We belong." The word itself comes from the French, parler, to speak. And that is exactly what the room was for. It was where you spoke to the world, where you presented yourself, where you performed the version of your life that you wanted other people to believe. And here is the detail that I find genuinely revealing. The parlour was almost always the woman's domain. She chose the furnishings, She arranged the flowers. She decided which books would be displayed on the table, and you can be certain those books were chosen not for reading but for signalling. A Bible, of course. Perhaps a volume of poetry, nothing too passionate. A book of engravings, ideally of landscapes or classical ruins. Nothing modern, nothing controversial, nothing that might suggest an independent or, God forbid, an adventurous mind. The parlour was a woman's public face, and like her actual face, it had to be composed at all times. Now step outside that parlour for a moment, step into the hallway, look at the front door, because that front door was, in a very real sense, the border crossing between two worlds. Inside, the private world. The world of family, of genuine feeling, of exhaustion and frustration and love and all the messy, complicated things that real life is made of. Outside, the public world, the world of judgment, the world where every step you took, every word you spoke, every person you were seen with, was being quietly catalogued by a society that had nothing better to do than watch. I don't say that flippantly. Victorian middle-class society, particularly for women, was genuinely structured around watching. There was an entire ritual called morning calls that existed for precisely this purpose, though I should note they almost never happened in the morning. They typically took place between 3 and 5 in the afternoon, which is one of those small Victorian contradictions that I find quietly charming. Here is how it worked. A woman would dress carefully, not too plainly, not too elaborately. She would take her calling card, a small piece of stiff card with her name engraved on it, nothing else. And she would visit the homes of her social circle, one by one. If the woman she was visiting was at home, she would be shown into the parlour. They would sit, they would talk, for exactly 15 minutes, not 14, not 16, 15. The conversation would cover acceptable topics, the weather, the health of family members, the quality of a recent sermon, perhaps a carefully neutral comment about a mutual acquaintance's new curtains. What the conversation would never cover, at least not directly, was anything real. No one discussed money. No one discussed illness in detail. No one discussed marital unhappiness or loneliness or fear or doubt. Those things existed, of course. They existed everywhere, but they lived behind the parlour door, in the private world, where they could be felt but never spoken. And if the woman she was visiting was not at home, that didn't mean she was actually out. Everyone understood that. Not at home was a code. It meant, I do not wish to see you today, or perhaps ever. A turned-down corner on a calling card meant one thing. An unreturned visit meant another. A card left without a visit meant something else entirely. The whole system was a language, and fluency in that language was not optional. It was survival. Now I want you to imagine something. Imagine you are a young woman in this world. You are 22 years old. You have been raised to understand these rules the way you understand breathing. You know which fork to use. You know how to enter a room. You know how to sit, how to stand, how to lower your eyes at precisely the right moment. You know all of this because your mother taught you, and her mother taught her, and her mother taught her, going back generations. This knowledge is your inheritance. It is in many ways the only inheritance you will ever receive, because here is the thing. In the England of the 1840s and 1850s, a woman could not own property once she married. She could not keep her own earnings. She could not sign a legal contract. She could not vote. She could not attend university. She could not enter most professions. What she could do was marry. And to marry well, she needed one thing above all else, a spotless reputation, not talent, not intelligence, not kindness or courage or wit. Those things were nice, certainly. They might make her a more pleasant companion. But they were not the currency. The currency was her name, her unblemished, unquestioned, unstained name. And that name was astonishingly easy to damage. A woman seen walking alone with a man who was not her husband, her father, or her brother. A woman who laughed too loudly at a dinner party. A woman who expressed a strong opinion on a political matter. A woman who was seen entering a house at an unusual hour, or leaving a gathering too late, or dancing twice with the same partner at a ball. Any of these things, any one of them, could start a whisper. And a whisper in the enclosed, watchful, endlessly circulating world of Victorian society could become a roar. Not immediately, not dramatically, but with a quiet, grinding inevitability that is, I think, one of the cruelest things about this entire system. The roar didn't sound like shouting. It sounded like silence. The silence of invitations not sent, the silence of doors not answered, the silence of a mother pulling her daughter gently aside and saying very quietly, "Perhaps we should not call on Mrs. So-and-so any more." That silence could destroy a life, and it did, over and over and over again. Meanwhile, in the clubs and coffee houses and private rooms of the same city, men were living by a completely different set of rules. Rules that were just as clearly understood, but that led to entirely different outcomes. And that contrast, that impossible, infuriating, endlessly fascinating contrast, is the story we're going to spend the rest of tonight exploring together. But to understand it properly, to really feel why it worked the way it did, we need to go deeper into the architecture. We need to understand what respectability actually meant in this world, who built it, and why it was constructed so carefully, so deliberately, to protect one group of people while quietly crushing another. That architecture is waiting for us. And it begins, as so many things in Victorian life began, in the most ordinary, most deceptive, most quietly powerful room in any English home, the dining room. That is exactly where we're going next. The dining room of a Victorian middle-class home was not simply a room where people ate. It was a theatre, a carefully staged, precisely choreographed performance space where the family presented itself, not to the world outside, but to each other, and to whatever guests might be present. The table itself tells you something. It's longer than it needs to be for the number of people sitting at it. The cloth is white, starched, pressed with an iron that was heated on the stove. The cutlery is arranged in a specific order, forks on the left, knives on the right, blades facing inward, a soup spoon at the top, a bread plate, a water glass. None of this is accidental. Every element of that table setting was dictated by published etiquette guides, books with titles like The Habits of Good Society, or Inquire Within Upon Everything, which sold hundreds of thousands of copies, and which middle-class families treated with something very close to religious reverence. These were not suggestion books. They were rule books, and the rules they contained were staggeringly specific. How to hold a knife, how to break bread, never cut it, how to eat soup tilting the bowl away from you, never toward, when to speak and when to remain silent, which topics were permissible at dinner and which were absolutely forbidden. Politics, for example, was not to be discussed in mixed company. Neither was money. Neither was religion in any detail beyond the most surface pleasantries. And illness, particularly anything relating to the body, was never, under any circumstances, to be mentioned at the table. I find that both fascinating and quietly suffocating. Because here is what all of this control was really about. It wasn't about soup spoons. It wasn't about the correct way to break bread. It was about demonstrating in every visible way that you belonged to the respectable class, that you knew the code, that you could be trusted. And the person in that dining room who carried the greatest burden of that demonstration was always, always the woman of the house. She planned the menu, she supervised the cooking, she arranged the seating, which was an act of social strategy so complex it could take an entire afternoon. She ensured that the right guests were placed next to the right partners, that no one was slighted by being seated too far from the head of the table, that no feuding families were placed within earshot of each other. She did all of this while appearing to do none of it. That was the trick. The effort had to be invisible. The performance had to look effortless. If a guest complimented the meal, the correct response was a modest deflection. If something went wrong, a dish arrived cold, a glass was knocked over, a servant made an error, it was her failure. Silently, invisibly, entirely her failure. The man of the house sat at the head of the table. He carved the joint. He led the conversation. He decided when the meal was over. And when it was, something happened that I think perfectly captures the architecture of this entire society. The women left the room, not the men, the women. After dinner, the hostess would rise, and every woman at the table would rise with her. They would withdraw to the drawing room, leaving the men alone with their port, their cigars, and their conversation. This was called the withdrawal, and it was one of the most ritualized moments in Victorian domestic life. The men stayed. They talked about politics, business, the stock market, colonial affairs, the sort of conversation that was considered too weighty, too complex, too serious for female minds. The women withdrew. They talked about whatever was deemed appropriate for them: music, needlework, children, the health of acquaintances. Nothing controversial, nothing that might suggest ambition or discontent or an inner life that extended beyond the walls of the home. This separation, this nightly ritual of division, was not a quirk. It was the physical expression of an entire philosophy, and that philosophy had a name: separate spheres. It's a term historians use to describe one of the most powerful, most pervasive, most quietly destructive ideas of the 19th century. And understanding it is absolutely essential to understanding everything that comes next in our story tonight. Here is the idea, stated simply. Men and women were fundamentally different creatures, designed by God and nature for fundamentally different roles. The man's sphere was the public world: business, politics, commerce, law, the military, the church, the empire, the world of action, ambition, competition, and power. The woman's sphere was the private world, the home, the family, the children, the hearth, the world of feeling, nurture, morality, and care. And here is the part that made this idea so insidious, so difficult to argue against. It wasn't framed as oppression, it was framed as reverence. Women, the Victorians told themselves, were not inferior. They were superior, morally superior, spiritually purer, closer to God. Their delicacy, their gentleness, their capacity for feeling, these were not weaknesses, they were gifts, and those gifts needed to be protected. Protected from the rough, corrupting, morally compromising world of public life. Protected from the ambition and aggression that the male sphere required. Protected, most of all, from any experience that might tarnish the purity that was their defining quality. You see the trap. You see it, don't you? The pedestal was a cage. The reverence was a leash. By telling women they were too good for the public world, Victorian society ensured they could never enter it. And by making purity their defining quality, it ensured that any deviation from that purity Any hint of scandal, any whisper of impropriety would not just damage them, it would destroy them, because you cannot fall from ground level, but you can fall from a pedestal, and the higher the pedestal, the further the fall, and the more spectacularly the world watches you shatter. Let that sit for a moment. Now, there was a poem that captured this idea more completely than perhaps any other single piece of writing in the Victorian era. It was called The Angel in the House, written by Coventry Patmore, published in 1854. And it became, in a very real sense, the unofficial manifesto of Victorian womanhood. The poem described Patmore's wife, Emily, as the ideal woman. Gentle, selfless, devoted. Her entire existence oriented around her husband's comfort and her children's welfare. She had no ambitions of her own, no desires that extended beyond the domestic sphere. She was, in Patmore's words, a creature of such perfect, quiet goodness that she was scarcely human at all. She was an angel, and that word, angel, became the standard against which every woman in Victorian England was quietly, relentlessly measured. Are you an angel? Are you selfless enough, gentle enough, pure enough, quiet enough? Do you stay within your sphere? Do you keep your opinions to yourself? Do you smile when you want to scream? Do you defer when you want to argue? Do you accept when you want to refuse? If yes, you are an angel. You are respectable. You are safe. If no, if you step outside that frame, even once, even slightly, even in ways that are entirely innocent, then you are something else. Something the Victorians had a very specific word for. Fallen, not mistaken, not human, not complex or struggling, or trying her best in an impossible situation. Fallen, as in fallen from grace, fallen from the pedestal, fallen from the angel's height into something dirty and shameful and irredeemable. And that word, fallen, carried weight that is almost impossible for us to fully comprehend today. A fallen woman was not simply someone who had made an error of judgment. She was a moral category, a species, a permanent condition from which there was no recovery, no redemption, no path back to the world she had left. I find that quietly devastating, because what it means, in practical terms, is that a woman's entire identity, her social existence, her financial security, her relationship with her family, her ability to be a mother, everything, all of it, balanced on a single, impossibly narrow definition of acceptable behaviour. And the slightest misstep, the slightest whisper, the slightest appearance of impropriety, whether real or imagined, could push her off that edge forever. Now, compare that with the man sitting across the dining table, the one who stayed behind with his port and his cigars while the women withdrew. His world operated on entirely different physics. A man could visit certain establishments after dark and return home without a single question asked. A man could maintain friendships with women of questionable reputation and suffer nothing more than a raised eyebrow at his club. A man could be known, actually known, to have had affairs, to have kept mistresses, to have fathered children outside of marriage, and his social standing would barely flicker. In fact, and this is the part that I think is the most revealing, in some circles these things actually enhanced his reputation. They made him worldly, experienced, a man of the world, someone who had lived, someone interesting. The very same behaviour that would have destroyed a woman, permanently, irreversibly, without appeal, made a man more attractive, more desirable, more powerful. Think about what that represents. Not just hypocrisy, though it was certainly that. Not just unfairness, though it was monstrously unfair. It was a system, a designed, maintained, enforced system in which one set of rule applied to half the population and an entirely different set applied to the other half, and the whole thing was wrapped in the language of nature, of God, of moral order, so that questioning it felt not just rebellious but blasphemous. That is the architecture we needed to understand, the foundation on which everything else in tonight's story is built. Because now, with that foundation in place, we can begin to look at what actually happened when a woman's reputation cracked. Not in theory, not in the abstract, in real life. To real women, with real names and real faces and real children and real futures that were taken from them. And one of the most powerful, most heartbreaking, most important of those stories belongs to a woman whose name most people have never heard. Her name was Caroline Norton. And her story, which begins in a London drawing room not so different from the one we've been sitting in tonight, changed the law of England. But it didn't save her. Not really. Not in the way that mattered. That story is waiting for us now, and it begins with a marriage that should never have happened, in a house that was never truly a home. Stay with me. We're just getting started. Let me tell you how it worked. Not in theory, but in practice. The actual mechanics of how a woman's life was taken apart piece by piece in Victorian England. Because understanding the machinery is important. It helps you feel what it was like to be caught inside it. It usually started with something small, a glance that lasted a moment too long, a letter that was opened by the wrong person, a name mentioned in a conversation where it shouldn't have appeared, a carriage seen outside a house at an unusual hour. Small things, tiny things, the kind of things that, in a world with more freedom, more privacy, more space for human complexity, would mean nothing at all. But this was not that world. In this world, those tiny things were seeds, and the soil of Victorian society was extraordinarily fertile for exactly this kind of seed. Here is how the process unfolded, and I want to walk you through it carefully, because I think the stages matter. Stage 1 was the whisper, just one person mentioning something to one other person in a private setting behind a closed door. I don't want to say anything, but that phrase, or something very like it, has probably destroyed more lives than any weapon ever invented. The whisper was never shouted. It was never public. It was offered as a confidence, a secret shared between trusted friends, and that was precisely what made it so powerful. Because a confidence, by its nature, demands to be passed along, not to everyone, just to one more person, who tells one more person, who tells one more. Stage 2 was the withdrawal. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the social world began to pull back. An invitation that usually arrived didn't. A morning call that was always returned wasn't. A woman who had always been warm at church was suddenly occupied, her eyes elsewhere, her conversation shorter than usual. Nothing was said directly. Nothing was confronted. Nothing was explained. The ground simply shifted beneath your feet, so gently that at first you might not even notice. Stage 3 was the cut. This was the formal, visible, unmistakable signal that you had been judged and found wanting. A cut was when someone you knew, someone you'd spoken to, dined with, perhaps even considered a friend, looked directly at you in public and then turned away, deliberately, visibly, in front of other people. A cut could happen at a ball, in a park, at a theatre, on a street corner, and it was devastating not because of what it was, a person turning away, but because of what it announced. It announced to everyone watching that this woman was no longer part of the circle, that associating with her carried a cost, that she was, in the language of the time, Not received. Not received. 2 words, and they meant you no longer exist in this world. Stage 4 was the silence. After the cut, there was nothing. No confrontation, no trial, no opportunity to explain or defend yourself. Just the vast, empty, echoing quiet of a world that had decided collectively and without appeal that you were finished. Your friends stopped writing. Your family distanced themselves, sometimes publicly, to protect their own reputations. Your husband, if you had one, might use the scandal as grounds to control you further or to separate from you entirely. Your children, if you had them, could be taken, legally, completely, without your consent. And you sat in your drawing room, with your white tablecloth and your carefully arranged books and your pressed curtains, and you waited for the silence to swallow you. I find that one of the most quietly brutal images in all of social history. A woman, sitting alone, in a room designed to impress people who will never come again. Now, Caroline Norton, let me tell you about her, because she deserves to be known. She deserves more than a footnote. She deserves a story told properly, with care, the way she would have wanted it told. Caroline Elizabeth Sarah Sheridan was born in 1808, into a family that was, by any measure, extraordinary. Her grandfather was Richard Brinsley Sheridan, the playwright, the politician, the wit, one of the most celebrated men of his generation, the man who wrote The School for Scandal and The Rivals, the man who could silence the House of Commons with a speech and make all of London laugh with a line. That talent, that sharp, glittering, dangerous talent for language, ran through the family like a vein of gold through rock, and Caroline inherited more of it than perhaps anyone else in the Sheridan line. She was, by all accounts, brilliant. Not just clever, not just well-read, but genuinely, luminously brilliant. She wrote poetry that was published and praised before she was 20. She had a wit that could disarm a room. She had a beauty that was striking enough to be remarked upon by virtually everyone who met her, dark-haired, dark-eyed, with what one contemporary described as a face that once seen was never forgotten. She was, in short, exactly the kind of woman that Victorian society did not know what to do with. Too brilliant to be quiet, too beautiful to be ignored, too talented to be contained within the narrow, airless box that the angel in the house ideology demanded. And she was poor. That's the detail that changes everything. Because the Sheridan family, despite their famous name, despite their connections, despite their glittering social position, were perpetually, hopelessly, crushingly short of money. Richard Brinsley Sheridan had died in debt. The family estate was gone. The fortune was gone. What remained was the name, the talent, and a set of daughters who needed to be married, because marriage was the only form of financial security available to them. Caroline was 19 when she married George Chappell Norton. He was a barrister, a member of Parliament, the younger brother of a lord. On paper, it was a respectable match, a sensible match, the kind of match that a family in the Sheridans' position could feel relieved about. But George Norton was not what he appeared on paper. He was, to put it as plainly as it deserves to be put, a violent man. Not occasionally, not when provoked, routinely, systematically. From the very earliest days of the marriage, he hit her, he threw things at her. On one occasion he kicked her in the side so severely that she had to be attended by a doctor. On another, during an argument about money, he seized her by the throat. These are not embellishments. These are details that Caroline herself would later describe in her own words in pamphlets she wrote and published, because she had no other way to make her voice heard. And here is the part that I need you to understand, because it is the hinge on which everything else turns. Under the law of England in the 1830s, none of this mattered. A husband could not be prosecuted for assaulting his wife. A wife could not leave her husband without his permission. A wife could not divorce her husband, not practically, not without an Act of Parliament that would cost thousands of pounds and require proof of the most extreme cruelty, the kind of proof that was almost impossible to obtain when the only witnesses were servants who depended on the husband for their livelihood. A wife could not even own the money she earned. Everything Caroline made from her writing, every shilling, every pound, belonged legally to George. He could take it. He did take it. He spent it on his own debts, his own pleasures, his own life, and the children, their 3 sons. Under the law of coverture, they belonged to the father, entirely, absolutely. The mother had no legal right to see them, no legal right to custody, no legal standing of any kind in relation to her own children. Caroline Norton was trapped in a violent marriage, with no money of her own, no legal rights, no ability to leave, and no recourse to the courts. But she did have one thing. She had her grandfather's gift. She had language. She had the ability to write sentences that made people stop and think and feel. And she had a friend. His name was William Lamb, the 2nd Viscount Melbourne, and in 1836 he was the Prime Minister of Great Britain. Their friendship was genuine. It was warm. It was, by all evidence, intellectually stimulating and emotionally sustaining for both of them. Melbourne was a widower. His own marriage had been famously unhappy, his wife, Lady Caroline Lamb, having conducted a scandalous and very public affair with Lord Byron, which we will come to later tonight. Melbourne understood loneliness. He understood being trapped in a life that didn't fit. He understood Caroline Norton. Whether their friendship ever became something more than friendship is a question that has been debated by historians for nearly 2 centuries. The honest answer is, we don't know. The evidence is ambiguous. What we do know is that they spent time together, that he visited her home, that they exchanged letters, that in the claustrophobic, watching, whispering world of Victorian London, this was more than enough. George Norton saw an opportunity, not to save his marriage, not to confront his wife, not to have an honest conversation about what their relationship had become, an opportunity to use her, to weaponize the friendship, to turn the whisper machine against his own wife for his own financial and political advantage. In 1836, George Norton sued the Prime Minister of Great Britain for criminal conversation with his wife. Criminal conversation. That was the legal term for adultery in this period, and a crimcon case, as it was known, was not a criminal proceeding in the modern sense. It was a civil action, brought by a husband against the man he accused of seducing his wife. The wife herself was not a party to the case. She could not testify. She could not defend herself. She could not even be present in the courtroom in any official capacity. Let that land for a moment. A trial about her body, about her honour, about her most intimate relationships, conducted entirely by men, about men, for men, and she had no voice in it. None. The trial took place on June the 22nd, 1836, in the Court of Common Pleas at Westminster Hall. The courtroom was packed. People had come from across London to watch, to listen, to be entertained. And make no mistake, that is what this was. Entertainment. The biggest show in town, and admission was free. The case was laid out by George Norton's lawyers with a mixture of innuendo and supposed evidence that was designed not to prove adultery in any rigorous legal sense, but to create an impression, an atmosphere, a feeling that something improper must have happened. Because why else would there be a trial? The witnesses were servants, men and women who worked in the Norton household, who depended on George Norton for their wages, their housing, their livelihoods. One by one they were brought to the stand and asked to describe what they had seen. One servant testified that he had once seen Lord Melbourne's carriage outside the house. Another said she had noticed that the drawing-room door was sometimes locked when Melbourne visited. A footman claimed he had seen Melbourne and Caroline sitting close together on a sofa. A maid described finding a particular piece of furniture slightly displaced from its usual position. That was the evidence. A carriage, a locked door, a sofa, a displaced piece of furniture. From these fragments, George Norton's legal team invited the jury to conclude that the Prime Minister of Great Britain had committed adultery with his client's wife. The absurdity of it might be almost amusing, if you could forget for a moment that a real woman's life was being dismantled in real time. Because while the lawyers argued and the servants testified and the jury listened and the public watched, Caroline Norton was somewhere in London, unable to speak, unable to respond, unable to do anything but wait for other people to decide her fate. She later described the experience of the trial in language that I find extraordinarily restrained, given the circumstances. She wrote about hearing, second-hand through friends and newspapers, what was being said about her in a courtroom she was not permitted to enter. She wrote about the particular agony of being discussed in the third person, as an object, a piece of evidence, a problem to be solved, by men who did not know her and did not care about her, except as a means to their own ends. There is something in that image that I find almost unbearable. A woman, sitting in a room somewhere in the same city, reading in the evening papers a distorted account of her own private life, knowing that every person she had ever known was reading the same account, and knowing that there was nothing, absolutely nothing, she could do about it. The newspapers, of course, printed everything, not just the testimony, but the reactions, the gossip, the speculation. They printed descriptions of the courtroom. They printed the names of the spectators. They turned the trial into a serial entertainment, published in daily installments, each one more lurid than the last. Caroline Norton's name was dragged through the press, through the coffee houses, through the drawing rooms of every family that considered itself respectable. Her reputation, the only currency she had, the only thing that stood between her and complete social annihilation, was shredded in public, in print, for entertainment. And the verdict? The jury deliberated for less than an hour. Some accounts say it was as little as 15 minutes. They found Lord Melbourne not guilty. The evidence, it turned out, was thin, contradictory, and in several cases almost certainly fabricated. George Norton's servants, the key witnesses, gave testimony that was so inconsistent that even the most sympathetic observer could not take it seriously. One servant contradicted another. Dates didn't align. Details shifted between the initial statements and the courtroom testimony. The whole case had the feel of something constructed, assembled from fragments and innuendo, rather than discovered from fact. Melbourne was acquitted. His reputation survived. His career continued. He remained Prime Minister. And Caroline lost everything. Not because the case proved she had done anything wrong. It didn't. The verdict was in her favour, technically. But that didn't matter. The accusation was enough. The trial was enough. The fact that her name had been spoken in a courtroom in connection with adultery, in newspapers that every servant and shopkeeper and society hostess in London could read. That was enough. The whisper machine did the rest. George Norton, emboldened by the scandal he had created, refused to let Caroline see their children. He sent them away, to relatives, to schools, to places she didn't know and couldn't reach. He took her income. He took her possessions. He used the law, every provision of it, to punish her for the crime of having embarrassed him, even though the court had found that she had done nothing wrong, and the law, every single word of it, was on his side. I want to pause here, because I think this moment deserves more than a passing glance. A woman, proven innocent by a court of law, was still destroyed, not by the verdict, but by the system. Not by what she did, but by what was said about her. Not by truth, but by rumour. And the man who started it all, who brought the false case, who used his own wife as a weapon in a political and financial game, suffered nothing. Nothing at all. There is something in that I find not just sad, not just unjust, but genuinely, quietly enraging. But Caroline Norton did something that almost no woman in her position had ever done before, something that changed the course of English law. She picked up a pen, and what she wrote, and what it led to, is exactly where our story goes next. What Caroline Norton did, in the months and years after the trial, was something that had almost no precedent. She wrote. Not poetry this time, not the delicate, acceptable literary work that society permitted women to produce. She wrote political pamphlets. She wrote open letters. She wrote directly to members of Parliament. She wrote with a fury and a precision that made people deeply uncomfortable, because the things she was saying were true, and everyone knew they were true, and nobody had ever said them so clearly before. Her first major pamphlet was called The Separation of Mother and Child by the Law of Custody of Infants Considered. It was published in 1837, the year after the trial, and it did something remarkable. It took the most private, most painful experience of her life, the loss of her children, and turned it into a legal argument. She did not beg. She did not plead. She did not appeal to sentiment or pity, though she had every right to both. Instead, she dismantled the law of custody point by point with the same precision a barrister would use. She showed, in clear, careful, devastating language, that the law of England gave a father absolute rights over his children, regardless of his character, regardless of his behaviour, regardless of whether he was a good father or a terrible one. A mother had no rights at all, none. A father could be violent. He could be neglectful. He could be absent for years. He could hand his children to strangers, to relatives, to anyone he chose. And the mother, the person who had carried those children, nursed them, raised them, loved them, had no legal standing to object. Caroline Norton wrote, "The present law of custody gives to the father of a child born in wedlock an absolute right to its society, and to the mother no right whatsoever." Read that again slowly. An absolute right, no right whatsoever. That was the law in England in the 19th century, in the most powerful, most supposedly civilized nation on earth. And Caroline Norton said so, out loud, in print, under her own name. I find that act of courage almost impossible to fully appreciate from where we sit tonight, because you have to understand what it cost her. Every word she published confirmed, in the eyes of respectable society, that she was not an angel. Angels did not write political pamphlets. Angels did not criticize the law. Angels did not draw attention to themselves, to their suffering, to the failures of the system that was supposed to protect them. By speaking, she proved she was not the kind of woman who deserved to be heard. That was the trap, and she walked into it with her eyes open, because the alternative was silence, and silence meant losing her children forever. Her pamphlet reached the right hands. Thomas Noon Talfourd, a member of Parliament and a friend of Charles Dickens, took up the cause. He introduced a bill, the Custody of Infants Bill, into the House of Commons. It was defeated the first time, and the second time. The opposition was fierce, predictable, and depressing. Men who had never been separated from their children stood up in Parliament and argued, with perfect confidence, that the existing law was just, that fathers knew best, that the natural order of things must not be disturbed. But Caroline kept writing. She kept pushing. She kept making the case over and over, with a persistence that was, in itself, a kind of quiet heroism. In 1839, the Custody of Infants Act was finally passed. It was modest by any standard. It allowed mothers of unblemished character to petition the courts for custody of children under 7, and for access to older children. That was it. Mothers of unblemished character, meaning, if there was any stain on your reputation, any whisper, any hint of scandal, you were excluded from even this narrow provision. And Caroline Norton, whose name had been through the courts and the newspapers and the drawing rooms of London, she could not use her own law. Let that sit with you for a moment. The woman who fought for the right of mothers to see their children could not benefit from the law she had helped create, because her reputation had been too thoroughly destroyed by a trial that found her innocent. I find that one of the most quietly devastating ironies in the entire history of English law. But the story does not end there, because what happened next was worse. In 1842, Caroline's youngest son William was 9 years old. He was living with George Norton's relatives in Scotland, far from his mother. She had not been allowed to see him. She had written letters. She had begged. She had done everything within her power, which was almost nothing, to maintain contact with her children. William fell from a horse. The injury was not treated properly. It became infected. By the time anyone thought to contact Caroline, her son was dying. The journey to Scotland must have been one of the longest of her life. The trains in the early 1840s were not the smooth, swift conveyances they would later become. They rattled and shook and stopped at every station. The countryside passed the window in a blur of green and grey, and every mile was a mile she had not been allowed to travel for years, because the law said her children belonged to their father, and their father had decided she should not see them. Try to imagine that journey, the hours of sitting in a carriage, not knowing whether you will arrive in time, not knowing whether the child you carried and nursed and sang to and held in your arms as a baby will still be alive when you reach him, not knowing whether the husband who took him from you will even allow you through the door. She arrived. She was allowed in. And she found William in agony, his small body burning with infection, his face already showing the signs that anyone who's watched a child die recognizes with a particular kind of dread. She held him. She stayed with him. And he died in her arms. He was 9 years old. 9. An age when a boy is still more child than anything else. An age of scraped knees and lost buttons and the particular smell that children have when they come in from playing in the rain. An age when bedtime stories still matter, and a mother's hand on a forehead can still fix almost anything. Almost anything. But not this. George Norton had not contacted her until it was almost too late. Whether that was negligence or cruelty is a question that different historians answer differently. But the result was the same. A mother who had been legally prevented from being with her child was finally allowed to hold him only as he was dying. Caroline Norton wrote about William's death. She wrote about it with a restraint that is, in some ways, more painful than any outpouring of grief could have been. She did not rage, she did not accuse, she did not describe the journey or the waiting or the moment when the breathing stopped. She simply stated what had happened in clear, quiet, factual prose, and let the reader feel the weight of it. That restraint is the emotion. That is something I want you to understand about Caroline Norton's writing, because it echoes through everything we've been exploring tonight. The most powerful moments are not the dramatic ones. They are the quiet ones, the ones where the words stop short of what they could say, and the silence fills in the rest. After William's death, Caroline continued to write. She campaigned for reform of the marriage laws. She argued with the same precision she had brought to the custody question that a married woman should have the right to own property, to keep her own earnings, to exist as a legal person rather than being absorbed entirely into her husband's identity. She wrote a pamphlet called English Laws for Women in the 19th Century. She wrote another called A Letter to the Queen on Lord Chancellor Cranworth's Marriage and Divorce Bill. She wrote with extraordinary clarity about the absurdity, the cruelty, the fundamental injustice of a system that treated married women as legal nonentities. And slowly, painfully, over the course of decades, the law began to change. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 made divorce possible through the courts, rather than requiring an Act of Parliament. The Married Women's Property Act of 1870 and its stronger successor in 1882 gave married women the right to own property and keep their earnings. Caroline Norton did not single-handedly cause these changes. History is never that simple. But she was the voice that forced the conversation. She was the woman who said, in public, what thousands of women were feeling in private. And she paid for it with her reputation, her children, her happiness, and very nearly her sanity. She died in 1877. She was 69 years old. In the last years of her life, George Norton had finally died, and she had remarried briefly to an old friend. But the damage had been done. Her health was broken. Her spirit, that fierce, brilliant, luminous spirit, was exhausted. She left behind a body of writing that changed the legal landscape of England. And she left behind a question that I think is worth sitting with tonight. Why did it take a woman's complete destruction to make people notice that the system was broken? Why did the law only listen when the person speaking had already been crushed by it? There is something in that question that I find deeply, quietly important. Because it's not just a Victorian question. It's a question that echoes forward through time into places we might recognise if we look carefully enough. It asks us to consider whether the systems we live inside, the ones that feel so natural, so inevitable, so obviously the way things should be, might also be designed, maintained, and enforced by choices that could be made differently. It asks us to wonder whether there is a Caroline Norton in our own time, writing pamphlets that no one is reading yet, naming injustices that everyone can feel, but no one has said out loud. It asks us to wonder whether we would recognize her if we saw her, or whether we would look away, the way the drawing rooms of London looked away, because the truth she was telling was too uncomfortable to face. These are not questions I can answer for you. They are questions I think are worth carrying, the way you carry a stone in your pocket, turning it over in your fingers now and then, feeling its weight, its smoothness, the particular way it sits in your hand. But that is a thought for later. For now, I want to take you somewhere different, somewhere that might seem, at first, like a completely separate world. But it isn't. It is the mirror image of everything we've just walked through. Because while Caroline Norton was being destroyed by scandal, there was a man, a poet, a lord, a figure of extraordinary fame and notoriety who had done things far worse than anything Caroline was even accused of, and he was not destroyed by it. He was celebrated for it. His name was George Gordon Byron. Lord Byron. And his story is the other side of the coin we've been holding all evening. The gaslight on the street outside has shifted. The fog has thickened. The clock on the mantelpiece has been ticking this whole time, steady and patient, marking the hours as they pass. Let us step into a different drawing room now. A grander one. One where the rules are the same, but the consequences are entirely, impossibly different. The year is 1812. The place is London. And a young poet has just published a work called Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, and the city has lost its mind. His name is George Gordon Byron. He's 24 years old. He's handsome, though not conventionally so. He has a club foot, a fact he was deeply self-conscious about his entire life. He has dark curling hair. He has eyes that multiple contemporaries described as the most expressive they had ever seen. And he has just written something that has made him, overnight, the most famous man in England. Byron himself described it best. "I awoke one morning," he later wrote, "and found myself famous." That line has become one of the most quoted sentences in literary history, and it is worth pausing on because of what it tells us about the difference between male and female experience in this world. Caroline Norton was brilliant. She was beautiful. She was a gifted writer, and her fame destroyed her. Byron was brilliant. He was beautiful. He was a gifted writer, and his fame made him untouchable. Same city, same century, same social world. Two completely different stories. Let me tell you what Byron did with his fame, because it is, I think, one of the most extraordinary case studies in the history of the double standard. Within months of Childe Harold's publication, Byron became the most sought-after guest in London. Every hostess wanted him at her dinner table. Every salon wanted him on its guest list. Women sent him letters, gifts, locks of hair. Men wanted to be seen with him, to be associated with his brilliance, his danger, his glamour. And Byron, it must be said, did very little to discourage any of this. He began an affair with Lady Caroline Lamb. She was married to William Lamb, the very same man who would later become Lord Melbourne, the very same man who would later be dragged into court over his friendship with Caroline Norton. The world of Victorian scandal was, in many ways, a remarkably small one. Lady Caroline Lamb was everything that a woman was not supposed to be. She was passionate, impulsive, dramatic, and utterly, recklessly unguarded in her emotions. When she first met Byron, she wrote in her journal a description that has become perhaps the most famous 3 words ever written about another human being: mad, bad, and dangerous to know. Their affair was intense, public, and catastrophically one-sided. Caroline Lamb fell in love with Byron with a completeness that frightened even her. She wrote him letters. She followed him. She dressed as a page boy to gain entrance to his rooms. She sent him a lock of her hair, and when he did not respond, she sent him a lock of hair that was not from her head. There is a story about a ball, one of those glittering Regency evenings where the candlelight caught the jewels and the laughter carried across the room, and everyone who mattered was watching everyone else. Caroline Lamb was there. Byron was there. And something happened. Some slight, some word, some look that was not given, and Caroline, in front of the assembled company, picked up a piece of broken glass and drew it across her own hand. The blood was real. The gesture was real. The desperation behind it was real. But what the room saw, what the story became as it was told and retold in drawing rooms across London, was not a woman in pain. It was a woman making a scene. It was a woman being dramatic. It was a woman who could not control herself, who was too much, too loud, too visible, too emotional to be tolerated. The word that was used, again and again, was unhinged, and in that word you can hear the entire machinery of the system at work. A woman who expressed her pain visibly, who refused to suffer in dignified silence, who let the world see what she was feeling, was not sympathized with. She was diagnosed. She was categorized. She was filed under mad and set aside. Byron, meanwhile, grew bored. He moved on. He always moved on. That was the pattern, the pursuit, the conquest, the withdrawal. And the woman, whoever she was left to deal with the wreckage alone. Lady Caroline Lamb dealt with it publicly. She made scenes. She spoke about Byron at parties. She wrote a novel, Glenarvan, in which she portrayed a thinly disguised version of Byron as a seductive, destructive villain. The novel was a sensation. Everyone read it. Everyone knew who it was about. And here is what happened. Byron's reputation grew. He became more fascinating, more desirable, more talked about. The affair with Lady Caroline Lamb, including her very public breakdown, only added to the mythology. He was the dark poet, the dangerous lover, the man whom women could not resist, and from whom they could not recover. Lady Caroline Lamb's reputation was destroyed, completely, permanently, irreversibly destroyed. Her husband eventually separated from her. Her social circle abandoned her. She was pitied at first, then mocked, then simply forgotten. She spent her final years in isolation, her mental health deteriorating, her brilliance dimming into a long, sad twilight. And I think it is worth knowing that before Byron, before the affair, before the madness label was attached to her name, Caroline Lamb had been brilliant in her own right. She had been witty, perceptive, deeply read. She had been one of the most sought-after conversationalists in London. People had wanted to be near her, not because of her connection to a famous poet, but because she was genuinely interesting. The affair with Byron did not just damage her reputation, it replaced her identity. She stopped being Caroline Lamb, the fascinating, brilliant woman. She became Caroline Lamb, the woman who went mad over Byron. Her entire existence was reduced to a footnote in someone else's story. Her brilliance was erased. Her pain was turned into anecdote. Her life became a cautionary tale told by people who had never taken the trouble to know her. She died in 1828. She was 42 years old. In her final years, she was cared for by servants in a house that had once been the centre of the most glittering social world in England. The rooms that had been filled with laughter and music and conversation were quiet now. The invitations had stopped coming long ago. Byron by then had been dead for 4 years. He had died in Greece, fighting for Greek independence, which only made him more romantic, more heroic, more legendary. He died young, beautiful, and famous. She died forgotten. Same scandal, same affair, same two people. One became a legend, the other became a cautionary tale. I want you to hold that contrast in your mind, because the story doesn't end there, it gets worse. After Caroline Lamb, Byron moved on to other affairs, many others. The specifics varied, but the pattern was always the same. He pursued, he conquered, he withdrew, and the woman was left to manage the consequences alone. But there was one relationship that went beyond even what London society was prepared to tolerate, and that was his relationship with his half-sister, Augusta Lee. Augusta was the daughter of Byron's father by an earlier marriage. She and Byron had grown up largely apart, meeting only occasionally as children. When they reconnected as adults, something happened between them that has been the subject of speculation and debate for 200 years. The evidence is circumstantial but substantial. Byron's own letters contain references that are, at the very least, deeply suggestive. Augusta gave birth to a daughter, Medora, whose parentage has never been definitively established, and Byron himself, in moments of either confession or provocation, made statements that strongly implied the relationship was more than fraternal. Now, think about what we've established tonight about Victorian society. Think about the whisper machine. Think about the 4 stages of social destruction. Think about what happened to Caroline Norton for simply being friends with a man. And then consider this. Byron was widely suspected of an incestuous relationship with his half-sister, and his social standing barely wavered. He was still invited to dinner, he was still celebrated in the salons, he was still the most talked about man in London. The rumours about Augusta added a layer of dark, Gothic fascination to his persona. They made him more compelling, more mysterious, more Byronic. That word, Byronic, it became a thing, a category, a type. The Byronic hero, the dark, brooding, morally ambiguous figure who operates outside the rules of ordinary society and is admired for it. It entered the language. It entered literature. It entered the cultural imagination so deeply that we still use it today, 2 centuries later, often without knowing where it came from. And where it came from was this. A man who did terrible things and was rewarded for them. A man whose scandals became his brand. A man who understood, perhaps instinctively, that the rules that applied to women did not apply to him, and who lived accordingly. In 1815, Byron married Annabella Milbank. She was intelligent, mathematical, earnest, and utterly unprepared for the reality of being married to Lord Byron. The marriage lasted 1 year. 1 year of what Annabella would later describe, in carefully measured legal language, as behaviour so extreme that she feared for her safety and her sanity. Byron had called her his Princess of Parallelograms, a nickname that tells you a great deal about both of them. She was genuinely gifted in mathematics, in logic, in the kind of precise, rigorous thinking that Byron found both fascinating and alien to his own temperament. She was also deeply moral, deeply principled, and deeply convinced that she could save him, that her steadiness could calm his chaos, that her order could tame his disorder. It is one of the oldest and most heartbreaking delusions in the history of human relationships. The belief that love can fix someone who does not want to be fixed. Annabella walked into that marriage with the best of intentions, and she walked out of it 1 year later with a newborn daughter in her arms and a knowledge of human darkness that she would carry for the rest of her life. What happened inside that marriage has never been fully established. Annabella kept her silence, partly out of dignity, partly out of strategy, and partly, I suspect, because the truth was so extreme that she knew no one would believe her. But the fragments that survive, in letters, in confidences shared with trusted friends, in legal documents prepared for a separation that was never quite a divorce, suggest something profoundly disturbing. She left him. She took their infant daughter, Ada, and she left. And she never spoke publicly about what had happened inside that marriage, because she understood, with a clarity that is both admirable and heartbreaking, that speaking would destroy her, not him. That daughter, Ada, would grow up to become Ada Lovelace, one of the most remarkable figures in the history of science and technology. Working with Charles Babbage on his analytical engine, she wrote what many historians consider the first computer program. She inherited her mother's mathematical brilliance and her father's creative fire, and she combined them in ways that neither parent could have imagined. Ada Lovelace never knew her father. Annabella made certain of that. She raised her daughter to value mathematics, logic, precision, everything that was the opposite of Byron's romantic chaos. And in doing so, she produced a woman whose contributions to human knowledge would outlast anything Byron ever wrote, though the world has been slower to recognize it. There is a quiet, poetic justice in that. The daughter of the man who embodied romantic chaos became one of the founders of the age of computation. The granddaughter of the most famous poet in England became a mathematician. Annabella Milbank's revenge was not spoken. It was lived. She was right. When the separation became public, London society split into two camps, Team Byron and Team Annabella. And while some sympathised with Annabella, the overwhelming tide of public sentiment ran toward Byron. He was the wounded poet, the misunderstood genius, the man whose wife had failed to appreciate his complexity. Annabella was the cold one, the rigid one, the woman who couldn't handle being married to a great man. That was the narrative, and the narrative stuck. Byron left England in 1816 and never returned. He travelled through Europe, writing, drinking, conducting affairs, and building the legend that would outlive him by centuries. He died in 1824 in Missolonghi, Greece, of a fever contracted while preparing to fight in the Greek War of Independence. He was 36 years old. His death was mourned across Europe. He was celebrated as a hero, a genius, a martyr to the cause of freedom. Vast crowds gathered, poems were written, monuments were erected. He became, in death, even more than he had been in life, a symbol of romantic defiance, of beauty, of the right of extraordinary individuals to live outside ordinary rules. And I want to pause here, because I want to be fair to Byron. He was a genuinely great poet. Childe Harold, Don Juan, his letters, they are brilliant, witty, alive with an energy and an intelligence that 2 centuries have not diminished. He was brave. He put his body where his beliefs were, going to Greece to fight when he could have stayed in his Italian villa and written poems about it. But the point is not whether Byron was talented. Of course he was. The point is what happened to him because of his scandals versus what happened to the women who were involved in those same scandals. Byron's affairs made him famous. Lady Caroline Lamb's involvement in the same affair made her infamous. Byron's rumoured relationship with his half-sister made him darkly fascinating. Augusta Lee spent the rest of her life under a cloud of shame, dependent on the goodwill of people who tolerated her only because cutting her entirely would have been too conspicuous. Byron's failed marriage made him a sympathetic figure. Annabella Milbank was cast as the villain of a story in which she was almost certainly the victim. The pattern is so consistent, so relentless, so perfectly symmetrical in its injustice, that it almost stops being surprising. Almost. But I don't think we should let it stop being surprising. I think the moment we accept it as normal, as just the way things were, we lose something important. We lose the ability to feel the weight of it. And I think that weight matters. Here is what I find most quietly devastating about the Byron story. It isn't that he got away with things that would have destroyed a woman. We've established that. It's that the very qualities that made him dangerous, his recklessness, his disregard for convention, his willingness to transgress, were the qualities that made him attractive. His scandal was his charisma. His transgression was his brand. and that brand was only available to men. A reckless woman was not exciting, she was ruined. A transgressive woman was not fascinating, she was fallen. A woman who lived outside the rules was not a romantic hero, she was a cautionary tale, a whisper, a name spoken behind closed doors with a shake of the head and a tisk of the tongue. The rules were the same for everyone. But the consequences were not. And the institution that did more than any other to amplify those consequences, to spread the whispers, to turn private scandal into public spectacle, was one that was growing more powerful with every passing year. The press, the newspapers, the pamphlets, the penny publications that were transforming the way information moved through Victorian society. They are waiting for us now, ink-stained and hungry, in the next part of our story. The rain has started outside. You can hear it against the windows, soft and steady. The fire in the grate has burned lower. The room is dimmer now, the shadows longer. Let us follow the sound of the printing press. It's not far from here. Imagine a street in London, not the wide gas-lit avenues of Mayfair or Belgravia, something narrower, grimmier, a lane off Fleet Street, where the air smells of ink and damp paper and the sour tang of hot metal type. Through a window at street level, you can see the press itself, a great iron machine that shudders and clanks as it works, feeding sheets of paper through its rollers with a rhythm that sounds, if you listen for long enough, almost like a heartbeat. This is where the whispers came to be amplified. This is where a private scandal became a public event. This is where a woman's name, spoken once in a drawing room, could be printed 10,000 times in a single morning and scattered across every coffee house, every railway carriage, every servant's kitchen in the country. The Victorian press was not the press we know today, but in some ways it was eerily similar. It was driven by the same fundamental engine, the knowledge that scandal sells and that nothing sells quite as well as the destruction of someone the public has decided to watch. Let me give you the numbers, because I think the scale matters. In 1800, the total daily newspaper circulation in London was roughly 60,000 copies. By 1850, it was over 300,000. By 1870, it was well over 1 million. And that doesn't count the weekly papers, the penny dreadfuls, the illustrated magazines, the pamphlets, and the broadsides that made up the vast, churning ecosystem of Victorian print culture. The reason for this explosion was simple. Technology. The steam-powered printing press, introduced in the 1810s, made it possible to produce newspapers faster and cheaper than ever before. The reduction, and eventually the abolition, of the stamp tax on newspapers in 1855 made them affordable to people who had never been able to buy one before, and the railways, those great iron arteries that were being driven across the landscape of England at extraordinary speed, made it possible to distribute papers from London to every corner of the country in a matter of hours. Information that had once taken days to travel now arrived before breakfast. And the kind of information that people most wanted to read, the kind that made them pick up one paper instead of another, the kind that kept the presses running and the money flowing, was scandal, specifically sexual scandal, and even more specifically sexual scandal involving women. Here is the thing that I find most quietly disturbing about the Victorian press. It was in many ways a perfectly respectable institution. The editors wore top hats. The proprietors sat on charitable boards. The newspapers themselves proclaimed their commitment to moral standards, to public decency, to the improvement of the nation's character. And then, with perfectly straight faces, those same editors would publish in meticulous detail the proceedings of divorce cases that described the most intimate, most private, most potentially humiliating aspects of a woman's life. They would print the testimony of servants who had listened at doors. They would recount, word by word, the evidence given about who had been in whose bedroom, at what hour, in what state of dress. They called this reporting. They called it the public interest. They called it holding society to account. But what it actually was, stripped of the respectable language, was entertainment. Profitable, popular, addictive entertainment, built on the systematic exposure and destruction of women who had no means of defending themselves in print, because that was the other part of the equation. A woman could not respond. She could not write a letter to the editor defending her reputation. She could not publish her own account. She could not, in most cases, even appear in court to testify on her own behalf. She was a character in a story being told by other people, about her, without her, and she had no power to shape the narrative. The men involved, meanwhile, had options. They had clubs where they could shape opinion privately. They had political connections that could apply pressure to editors. They had the simple, enormous advantage of being taken seriously when they spoke, in a world where a woman's word was always already in question. And there was another layer to this that I think deserves attention. The press was not a monolithic entity. It was an ecosystem. At the top were the respectable broadsheets, the Times, the Morning Post, papers that maintained a veneer of editorial dignity even when they were printing the most salacious details of a divorce case. Below them were the penny papers, cheaper, louder, more openly sensational. Below those were the illustrated weeklies, which added images to the mix, printing sketches of courtroom scenes, portraits of the women involved, illustrations of the houses and the streets where the alleged events had taken place. And below everything else were the broadside ballads, the cheap printed songs sold on street corners for a halfpenny, which took the details of a scandal and turned them into verse. A woman's private life, her alleged transgressions, her supposed sins, set to music and sung in pubs and markets across the country. A form of public humiliation so complete that it reached people who couldn't even read. Each layer of the press fed the others. A detail printed in the Times would be amplified by the penny papers, illustrated by the weeklies, and versified in the broadsides. The scandal would grow with each iteration, each retelling adding embellishment, each version moving further from whatever the truth had actually been. By the time the story reached the broadest audience, it bore almost no resemblance to reality. But didn't need to. It wasn't about reality. It was about entertainment, about moral spectacle, about the pleasurable frisson of watching someone else's destruction from a safe distance. The editors understood this. They understood it with the precision of businessmen, which is exactly what they were. They knew that a woman's name in a headline sold papers. They knew that the words adultery and divorce and shocking revelations moved copies off the newsstand faster than any political analysis or foreign correspondence. They knew that their readers, the growing, literate, morally anxious middle class, wanted scandal the way they wanted sugar in their tea, regularly, reliably, and in carefully measured doses that allowed them to feel outraged without feeling implicated. Let me give you a specific example, because I think specific cases help us feel this in a way that general descriptions cannot. In 1870, a case came before the divorce courts that became the biggest scandal of the decade. Sir Charles Mordaunt, a member of Parliament, filed for divorce from his young wife Harriet. She was 21 years old. He accused her of adultery with several men, including, extraordinarily, the Prince of Wales himself, the future King Edward VII. The case was a sensation. The newspapers went wild. Every detail was printed, discussed, analysed, illustrated. Harriet Mordaunt's name was on every front page. Her private life was dissected in public. The testimony described her alleged affairs in language that was, by Victorian standards, shockingly explicit. And here is what happened to the people involved. The Prince of Wales was called as a witness. He appeared in court, denied the allegations, and was believed. He returned to his life of privilege, his social calendar, his position as heir to the throne. The brief inconvenience of a court appearance was absorbed into his biography as a minor anecdote, a colourful detail in the life of a man who was already known for his appetites. The other men named in the case similarly emerged without lasting damage. A few weeks of gossip, a few raised eyebrows at their clubs. Then the world moved on, and they moved with it. Harriet Mordaunt was declared insane. Whether she was genuinely mentally ill, or whether the declaration was a legal strategy designed to prevent the divorce, historians still debate. But the result was the same. She was confined to an asylum. She spent the next 36 years in institutional care. She died in 1906, still confined. Her life effectively ended at the age of 21. 36 years in an asylum. While the men whose names had been linked with hers went on with their lives as if nothing had happened. I want you to sit with that, because I think the sheer disproportion of it tells you everything you need to know about how this system worked. The press didn't create the double standard. It existed long before the first newspaper was printed, but the press amplified it. It took the whisper and turned it into a shout. It took the drawing room judgment and turned it into a national verdict. It gave the system reach and speed and a kind of permanent memory that the old world of private gossip could never have achieved. Once your name was in print, it was in print forever. The paper could be saved, filed, referenced, passed along. The shame was no longer contained within a social circle. It was recorded. It was archived. It became part of the permanent record of your life, and there was nothing, absolutely nothing you could do to erase it. There was another case, earlier, that illustrates this even more sharply. In 1886, Lord Colin Campbell filed for divorce from his wife, Lady Colin Campbell, born Gertrude Elizabeth Blood. The case was extraordinary for several reasons, not least because it was a rare instance of both parties accusing the other of adultery. Lady Colin Campbell named her husband's infidelities. Lord Colin Campbell named 4 men he accused of being his wife's lovers, including a duke, a military officer, a doctor, and the head of the London Fire Brigade. The trial lasted 18 days. It was, by some accounts, the most widely followed court case in Victorian England since the Norton-Melbourne trial 50 years earlier. The newspapers covered it in breathless detail. Illustrations of Lady Colin appeared in magazines across the country. Her face, her clothes, her expressions in the courtroom, everything was consumed by a public that could not get enough. The verdict went against both parties. The divorce was denied. Neither side proved its case to the satisfaction of the jury, and here is what followed. The men Lady Colin had accused of involvement in her husband's infidelities were largely unaffected. Lord Colin Campbell himself, despite being accused of precisely the same behaviour he accused his wife of, resumed his life with minimal social consequence. Lady Colin Campbell was ruined, not legally. The verdict had not gone against her specifically, but socially the damage was total. She'd appeared in a courtroom. She had been discussed in the press. Her name had been associated with scandal, publicly, irreversibly in print. That was enough. She spent the rest of her life rebuilding slowly, painfully, and never completely. She became a journalist and art critic, carving out a career in the one space that would accept a woman whose reputation had been damaged. But the drawing rooms of polite society were closed to her forever. I find something both admirable and heartbreaking about that. A woman who lost everything in the court of public opinion, who had her life dismantled by newspapers and by a system that judged her more harshly for the simple fact of being female, picked herself up and built a new life with the only tools she had left. Her mind, her pen, her refusal to disappear. But she should not have had to do that. That is the point. She should not have had to rebuild at all. The press, the vast and growing and endlessly hungry press, was not a neutral recorder of events. It was a participant. It chose what to publish and what to suppress. It chose whose name to print in full and whose to protect behind initials and euphemisms. It chose, with remarkable consistency, to protect men of power and to expose women who had none. And the public, the reading, buying, gossiping public, rewarded those choices with their pennies and their attention. They bought the papers that printed the scandals. They passed them along to friends. They discussed the cases over breakfast, over dinner, in the spaces between hymns at church on Sunday. They consumed the destruction of women's lives the way we consume. Well, I think you can fill in the comparison yourself. Some things don't change as much as we'd like to believe. Now. I want to take you somewhere quieter, somewhere more intimate, because the press and the courtroom are public stages, and they tell a certain kind of story. But the real story, the one that I think cuts deepest, happened in private, behind closed doors, inside marriages that the law made almost impossible to escape. We've touched on this. We've seen glimpses of it in Caroline Norton's story. But we haven't yet looked directly at the legal architecture that trapped women inside marriages, stripped them of their identities, and made them, in the eyes of the law, invisible. That architecture had a name, coverture, and it was, I think, one of the most quietly extraordinary legal concepts in the history of the English-speaking world. The rain is steady now against the windows. The clock ticks on. The fire has settled into embers, that deep glowing orange that gives off more warmth than light. Let us step into that quieter room, the one where the real damage was done, not in headlines, not in courtrooms, but in the law itself, coverture. The word itself comes from the French, couvrir, to cover, and that is exactly what the doctrine did. It covered a woman. It covered her identity. It covered her legal existence. It covered her so completely that, in the eyes of the law, she disappeared. Here is how William Blackstone, the great legal authority of the 18th century, described it. And I want to read his words carefully, because they are among the most important words ever written about the legal status of women in the English-speaking world. By marriage, the husband and wife are one person in law. That is, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, or at least is incorporated and consolidated into that of the husband, under whose wing, protection, and cover she performs everything. Suspended, that is the word he used. The legal existence of the woman is suspended, not reduced, not limited, suspended, as in paused, as in put on hold, as in she stops being a legal person for the duration of the marriage, under whose wing, protection, and cover, notice the language, wing, protection, cover. These are gentle words, kind words, words that suggest safety and shelter and care, and that is precisely what makes them so dangerous. Because the reality they described was not gentle, it was not kind, it was not safe. The reality was this. The moment a woman married, everything she owned became her husband's property. Her money, her land if she had any, her furniture, her jewellery, her clothing, the books on her shelf, the pen in her hand, everything. If she had inherited money from her family, it became his. If she earned money through her own labour, her own talent, her own industry, it became his. If someone gave her a gift, it became his. If she wrote a novel and it sold 1,000 copies, the proceeds were his. If she painted a picture and it hung in a gallery, the payment was his. She owned nothing. Literally, legally, absolutely nothing. And it went further than property. Under coverture, a married woman could not sign a contract. She could not file a lawsuit. She could not make a will without her husband's permission. She could not conduct business in her own name. She could not open a bank account. She could not be held legally responsible for her own debts, because she could not legally incur debts, because she did not legally exist as a person capable of entering into financial agreements. I want to pause on that, because I think the sheer completeness of it is hard to absorb. Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering that you cannot buy anything, you cannot sell anything, you cannot sign anything, you cannot earn anything, or rather you can earn, but everything you earn belongs to someone else, automatically, without discussion, without appeal. You cannot even be sued, because being sued requires being a legal person, and you are not one. That was the legal reality of every married woman in England for centuries, not in some distant medieval past, in the 19th century, in the age of railways and telegraphs and steam engines and the beginning of what we would call the modern world. And here is the part that connects this directly to our story about scandal. Because coverture didn't just affect property, it affected everything. It created the conditions in which scandal could destroy a woman completely while barely touching a man. Consider divorce. Before 1857, obtaining a divorce in England required a private act of Parliament. This was exactly as difficult, as expensive, and as rare as it sounds. Between 1670 and 1857, a period of nearly 200 years, only about 300 divorces were granted by Parliament. 300 in almost 2 centuries. And of those 300, only 4 were granted to women. 4. The reason for this disparity was not accidental. It was built into the system by design. A man seeking a parliamentary divorce needed to prove that his wife had committed adultery. That was it. Adultery alone was sufficient grounds. A woman seeking a parliamentary divorce needed to prove not just adultery, but adultery aggravated by some additional factor: incest, bigamy, cruelty so extreme as to endanger her life, desertion. Adultery alone, the same adultery that was sufficient to end a marriage when a man complained of it, was not enough when a woman was the one seeking relief. The logic behind this disparity was stated openly, without embarrassment, by the men who maintained it. A wife's adultery was more serious than a husband's, they argued, because a wife's adultery threatened the legitimacy of the family line. A husband's adultery, while regrettable, posed no such threat. It was, in the language of the time, a lesser offence. A lesser offence, the same act, the same betrayal, the same breaking of the same vow. But when a man did it, it was a lesser offence. I find that simultaneously logical if you accept the premise that women exist primarily to produce legitimate heirs, and deeply, profoundly enraging if you accept the premise that women are human beings. In 1857, the Matrimonial Causes Act changed the mechanics of divorce. It established a dedicated court, the Court for Divorce and Matrimonial Causes, which meant that divorce no longer required an Act of Parliament. It could be obtained through the courts at significantly less expense and by ordinary people, not just the wealthy and the titled. This was genuinely progress. It made divorce accessible in a way it had never been before. But the double standard was written directly into the new law, in language that was clear and deliberate. A husband could obtain a divorce by proving his wife's adultery. That was the only ground he needed. A wife could obtain a divorce only by proving her husband's adultery combined with cruelty, or adultery combined with desertion of 2 years or more, or adultery combined with incest, bigamy, rape, or sodomy. Adultery alone was not sufficient. For a woman, betrayal had to come with something extra, something worse, something that even the men who wrote the law could not ignore. And the process of obtaining a divorce, even under the new system, was itself a form of punishment for women. Because the proceedings were public, the details were reported in the newspapers, the testimony was graphic, and the woman at the centre of it all, whether she was the petitioner or the respondent, was exposed to a level of public scrutiny that was, for a Victorian woman, a form of social death. A man could survive a divorce and remarry. He could rebuild his reputation. He could re-enter society. His club would not expel him. His friends would not abandon him. His career would continue. A woman who had been through a divorce court was marked, permanently, regardless of whether she had been the wronged party or the wrongdoer. The simple fact of having been involved in divorce proceedings was enough to exclude her from respectable society for the rest of her life. This is the thing I keep coming back to. The system was not just unfair in its outcomes, it was unfair in its architecture. It was designed from the ground up with different rules for different people, and those different rules always worked in favour of the same group. Let me give you an example that I think makes the everyday reality of this system feel concrete, because it's easy to talk about laws and principles in the abstract. It's harder, and more important, to imagine what they felt like in practice. Imagine a woman, a respectable middle-class woman, the wife of a merchant or a clerk or a minor professional. She is not famous. She will never appear in the newspapers. She will never be the subject of a parliamentary debate. She is ordinary in the best sense of that word. She lives a quiet life in a terraced house in a respectable neighbourhood. She has a talent. Perhaps she paints. Perhaps she writes. Perhaps she is skilled at needlework of a quality that people are willing to pay for. She begins quietly to earn a little money, not much, enough to buy small luxuries, enough to feel, for the first time, that she has something of her own. Under coverture, that money is not hers, it belongs to her husband. He can take it. He can spend it. He can demand it from her, and if she refuses, she's breaking the law, not him. Her earnings, the product of her talent, her time, her effort, are his property the moment they come into existence. Now imagine that her husband drinks, or gambles, or simply manages money poorly. Imagine that the household debts are mounting, that the creditors are calling, that the landlord is threatening eviction. She watches the money she earned, the money that could have kept the family afloat, disappear into his debts, his pleasures, his mismanagement, and she can do nothing. Or imagine another woman, a woman who married young, who chose badly, or who had no choice at all. Her husband is cruel, not in any dramatic, newsworthy way. He doesn't beat her in public. He doesn't create scenes. He is simply, quietly, persistently unkind. He controls her movements. He reads her letters. He decides who she may visit and who she may not. He withholds money for household expenses as a form of punishment. He tells her, regularly, that she is stupid, that she is ungrateful, that no one else would have married her. She wants to leave. But where would she go? She cannot rent a room because she cannot sign a lease. She cannot access her own inheritance if she had one, because it became his on the day they married. She cannot earn money that she is legally entitled to keep. She cannot take her children, because they belong to him. She cannot even write to her family for help without his knowledge, because the post comes to his house and he has every right to open it. She is trapped. Not by locks or chains or physical barriers, but by something more effective than any of those things. She is trapped by the law, by the simple, elegant, devastating legal fiction that says she does not exist. These were not unusual stories. They were ordinary. They were happening in thousands of households across England every day, to women whose names were never recorded and whose suffering was never acknowledged, because the system told everyone, including the women themselves, that this was normal. This was how things worked. This was just marriage. Now, there is another aspect of coverture that I think we need to sit with, even though it is difficult. Because it is perhaps the most intimate, most personal, most quietly horrifying part of the whole system. Under coverture, a husband had a legal right to his wife's body. I want to be careful about how I say this, because I think the words matter. A married woman could not, under English law, refuse her husband. The legal concept of marital rape did not exist. It was not merely that it was difficult to prosecute, or that courts were unsympathetic, or that social attitudes made it hard to report. It was that the law did not recognize it as a thing that could happen. The logic was Blackstone's logic. Husband and wife are one person. A man cannot assault himself. Therefore, a man cannot assault his wife. The doctrine of coverture, which said that a woman's legal identity was absorbed into her husband's, was extended to its logical, terrible conclusion. This remained the law in England until 1991, not 1891, 1991. Within the lifetimes of many people alive today. I mention this not to shock, but because I think it is essential context for understanding why Victorian scandals destroyed women so completely. A woman in a violent marriage had no legal escape. A woman in a loveless marriage had no practical escape. A woman who sought comfort, companionship, even just friendship outside her marriage was risking everything, because the system that trapped her was the same system that would punish her for trying to get out. The men who designed this system did not think of themselves as cruel. That is perhaps the most difficult part of all this to grapple with. They thought of themselves as protectors. They believed, genuinely believed, that they were creating a framework of care, that women needed to be covered, sheltered, managed, because they were too delicate, too emotional, too vulnerable to manage themselves. The cage was lined with silk. The lock was decorated with flowers, and the key was in someone else's pocket. Now, let me tell you about the women who, despite all of this, despite the law and the press and the whisper machine, and the relentless grinding machinery of respectable society, refused to stay quiet, refused to disappear, refused to accept that the story being told about them was the only story there was. We've already met one of them, Carolyn Norton. But she was not alone. There were others, women who used the few tools available to them, their pens, their voices, their sheer stubborn persistence, to push back against a system that was designed to silence them. Their stories are not triumphant, not in the way we might want them to be. Victory, in this context, was often partial, often bitter, often achieved at enormous personal cost. But they matter. They matter because they show us that the system, for all its power, was not unopposed, that even in the most suffocating, most controlled, most perfectly designed cage, there were always people who found the cracks. The fire has burned very low now. The embers glow softly, pulsing with a warmth that fills the room without illuminating it. The rain continues outside, gentler now, a sound that has become so familiar over the course of this evening that you might have stopped noticing it. The clock ticks, the house settles, and the women who refuse to disappear are waiting for us now, quiet and patient, in the next part of our story. Let me start with a name you probably know, though you may not know the story behind it. George Eliot, one of the greatest novelists in the English language. The author of Middlemarch, which many critics consider the finest novel ever written in English. The author of Adam Bede, Silas Marner, The Mill on the Floss, Daniel Deronda. A writer of such extraordinary depth, intelligence, and emotional precision that her work has never gone out of print in more than a century and a half. George Eliot was not her real name. Her real name was Mary Ann Evans, and she used a male pseudonym for the same reason that the Bronte sisters used male pseudonyms, for the same reason that countless women throughout the 19th century hid their identities behind male names or initials or anonymity. Because a woman's name on a title page was a liability. It invited prejudice. It invited dismissal. It invited reviews that focused on the author's gender rather than on the quality of the work. And it invited, inevitably, scrutiny of the author's personal life, scrutiny that could, and often did, overshadow everything she had written. Mary Ann Evans had good reason to fear that scrutiny, because she was living openly and unapologetically with a man who was not her husband. His name was George Henry Lewes. He was a writer, a philosopher, a critic, and he was married to someone else. His wife, Agnes, had borne children by another man, a situation that Lewes had initially tolerated with unusual generosity. But the law, that familiar, implacable law, prevented him from divorcing Agnes, because his earlier acceptance of her infidelity was considered legal condonation, and condonation cancelled the right to divorce. So Lewes was trapped in a marriage he could not leave, and Mary Ann Evans fell in love with him, and in 1854 they did something that was, for a Victorian woman, almost inconceivably brave. They moved in together, openly, without marriage, without apology. They called each other husband and wife. They travelled together. They entertained together. They lived, in every practical sense, as a married couple, and everyone knew they were not. The consequences were immediate. Mary Ann's family cut her off. Her brother Isaac refused to speak to her or write to her. He maintained that silence for over 20 years, until George Lewes died and Mary Ann married another man, at which point Isaac sent a brief, formal letter of congratulation. 20 years of silence ended by a piece of legal paper. Respectable women would not receive her. She could not attend dinner parties. She could not make morning calls. She could not participate in any of the social rituals that constituted the public life of a Victorian woman. She was, in every sense that mattered to Victorian society, fallen. And here is where the story becomes extraordinary. She kept writing. She wrote some of the greatest novels in the English language. She wrote with a depth of psychological insight, a richness of social observation, and a moral complexity that no other novelist of her generation could match. And the literary world, which could not deny the quality of what she produced, was forced into an awkward compromise. They praised the work, they celebrated the genius, but they would not invite the woman to dinner. Queen Victoria herself read and admired George Eliot's novels, but she would not receive her at court. The novels were acceptable. The woman behind them was not. I find that particular detail one of the most perfectly absurd illustrations of the Victorian double standard. A queen could read a fallen woman's books, could be moved by them, could discuss them with her ladies-in-waiting, but could not sit in the same room with the person who wrote them. The genius was welcome, the woman was not. And George Henry Lewis, the man who was in precisely the same living arrangement, who was equally unmarried, equally scandalous, equally in defiance of convention, he suffered almost no social consequences at all. He attended clubs, he dined with publishers, he moved through the literary world with ease and comfort. He was considered an interesting man with an unconventional domestic arrangement. She was a fallen woman, he was a free thinker, same situation, same house, same bed, if we're being honest about it. Two completely different social outcomes. Mary Ann Evans died in 1880. In the last years of her life, she had married a man named John Cross, who was 20 years her junior. The marriage was brief. She died 7 months later. But the marriage restored her respectability. Isaac wrote to her. Society received her. The doors that had been closed for a quarter of a century opened just like that, because a piece of legal paper said she was married. That tells you everything you need to know about what respectability actually was. It was not about morality. It was not about virtue. It was about paperwork. Now, there is another woman I want to tell you about. A woman whose story is in many ways even more remarkable than Mary Ann Evans, because she did not simply defy convention by living her private life on her own terms. She defied convention by speaking publicly about something that no respectable woman was supposed to even know about, let alone discuss. Her name was Josephine Butler, and she may be the bravest woman in this entire story. Josephine Butler was born in 1828 into a prosperous, reform-minded family. She married George Butler, an academic and clergyman, in 1852. Their marriage was, by all accounts, genuinely happy, a genuine partnership of equals in a world that did not believe such partnerships were possible or desirable. In 1864, tragedy struck. Their youngest daughter, Eva, fell from a banister in their home and died. She was 5 years old. Josephine was devastated, and in her grief she did something that would change the course of her life and the course of English law. She went looking for suffering greater than her own. She found it in the workhouses and the streets of Liverpool, among the women who lived outside the boundaries of respectable society, women who worked as prostitutes, women who had been abandoned, exploited, discarded, women whose names were never spoken in drawing rooms except as warnings. Josephine Butler looked at these women and she did not see moral failures. She did not see fallen creatures who had chosen their fate. She saw human beings trapped by poverty, by lack of education, by the same system of inequality that constrained every woman, taken to its most extreme and visible conclusion. And then, in 1869, Parliament passed the Contagious Diseases Acts, and Josephine Butler found her cause. The Contagious Diseases Acts were, on their surface, a public health measure. They were designed to reduce the spread of venereal disease in military towns. The mechanism was simple. Police could identify women they suspected of being prostitutes, arrest them, and subject them to compulsory medical examination. If found to be infected, they could be detained in a lock hospital for up to a year. The women had no right to refuse the examination. They had no right to challenge the police's identification. They had no right to legal representation. They had no right to appeal. And the men, the soldiers and sailors who were the customers, whose demand created the market, whose behaviour spread the disease, they were not examined. They were not detained. They were not subject to any provision of the Acts whatsoever. Let that sit with you. A law designed to address a disease transmitted by sexual contact between men and women applied only to the women. Only the women were suspected. Only the women were examined. Only the women were confined. The men were invisible. The men were, as far as the law was concerned, blameless. Josephine Butler saw this, and she was enraged. Not quietly, not privately, publicly, passionately and persistently. She launched a campaign to repeal the Contagious Diseases Acts that lasted 16 years. 16 years! And in the course of that campaign, she did things that no respectable Victorian woman had ever done. She spoke in public. Not to small gatherings of sympathetic women in private drawing rooms, but to large, mixed audiences in public halls. She spoke about prostitution. She spoke about sexual exploitation. She spoke about venereal disease. She used words that respectable women were not supposed to know, let alone say out loud in front of men in public. She was attacked, physically attacked. At speaking engagements, mobs threw stones through windows. She was burned in effigy. She received death threats. She was called, in newspapers and in Parliament, every name that could be used to discredit a woman: hysterical, mad, unnatural, unwomanly, and she kept going, for 16 years. Here is what I find most remarkable about Josephine Butler. She was not a radical by temperament. She was a clergyman's wife. She was devoutly religious. She dressed modestly. She spoke softly. She was, in almost every visible way, exactly the kind of woman that Victorian society approved of. And that was precisely what made her so dangerous, because the system's usual weapons didn't work against her. She couldn't be dismissed as a fallen woman because her personal life was beyond reproach. She couldn't be dismissed as an angry spinster because she was happily married. She couldn't be dismissed as uneducated because she was well-read and articulate. She couldn't be dismissed as unladylike because she was the very model of Victorian femininity. She simply happened to believe that the law should apply equally to everyone, and for that belief she was treated as if she were the most dangerous woman in England. The Contagious Diseases Acts were finally repealed in 1886. The campaign had cost Josephine Butler her health, her privacy, her peace of mind, and much of the social standing that her position as a clergyman's wife would normally have guaranteed. But she had won, and in winning, she had done something even more important than changing a specific law. She had demonstrated publicly and undeniably that the system's treatment of women was not natural. It was not inevitable. It was not ordained by God or by biology or by the immutable order of the universe. It was a choice made by people, and it could be changed by people. There were others. I want to mention them, even briefly, because they deserve to be remembered. There were the women who wrote. The Bronte sisters, Charlotte, Emily and Anne, who published under the names Currer, Ellis and Acton Bell, because they understood that the literary world would not take a woman's novel seriously. When Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre was published in 1847 and became a sensation, critics spent as much time speculating about the author's gender as they did discussing the book itself. When it was finally revealed that Currer Bell was a woman, some reviewers actually revised their opinions of the novel downward. The same words on the same pages were somehow worth less because a woman had written them. There was Harriet Martineau, who became one of the first female journalists in England, writing about economics, politics, and social reform at a time when women were not supposed to have opinions about any of those subjects. She was widely admired and widely resented, often by the same people. There was Florence Nightingale, who understood the scandal system so thoroughly that she used it strategically. She cultivated a public image of such impeccable respectability, such perfect feminine virtue, that she became effectively criticism-proof. She used that armour to do things that no woman had done before, reorganising military hospitals, establishing nursing as a profession, challenging the medical establishment. She played the system's game so well that it couldn't touch her, and then she used her untouchable position to change the rules. I find that both inspiring and deeply sad. Inspiring because it worked, sad because it shouldn't have been necessary. A woman should not have needed to construct a fortress of respectability around herself just to be allowed to do useful work, and there were the women whose names we don't know, the ones who resisted quietly, in private, in ways that were never recorded, the women who helped other women escape violent marriages, the women who sheltered friends whose reputations had been destroyed, the women who simply, stubbornly, refused to participate in the cutting, the shunning, the whispered destruction of other women's lives. We don't have their names, we don't have their stories, but they existed. They must have existed, because no system of control, however powerful, however perfectly designed, ever achieves total compliance. There are always people who look at the machine and say, quietly, no. Those quiet refusals matter. They mattered then. They matter now. The fire has gone to ash now. Just the faintest glow remains deep in the grey, a memory of warmth more than the thing itself. The rain has softened to barely a whisper against the glass. The clock ticks, slower now, or perhaps that is just how it seems. Perhaps time moves differently at this hour. The story is beginning to turn now, not toward a happy ending, because history does not offer those, not neatly, not completely, but towards something, a shift, a crack in the wall, a slow, difficult, painful turning of a tide that had been running in one direction for so very long. That turning is where we go next. It did not happen all at once. Of course it didn't. The kind of change we're talking about, a fundamental shift in how an entire society thinks about women, about men, about power, about reputation, about who gets to be fully human. That kind of change doesn't happen in a single moment. It doesn't happen with a single law. It doesn't happen because one brave person stands up and says the right words at the right time, though brave people and right words certainly help. It happens the way dawn happens, slowly, in degrees. So gradually that if you're watching for it, you almost can't see it move. But if you look away and look back, the light has changed. The light began to change in the second half of the 19th century, and it changed through a series of laws, each one modest, each one incomplete, each one fought for with extraordinary difficulty, and each one chipping away, piece by piece, at the architecture of inequality we've been exploring all evening. We've already touched on the Custody of Infants Act of 1839 and the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, but the changes that followed, in the decades after, are worth walking through, because they show us the shape of the turning. In 1870, the first Married Women's Property Act was passed. It was honestly a modest piece of legislation. It allowed a married woman to keep her own earnings, up to £200. It allowed her to inherit small sums and personal property in her own name. It did not give her full property rights. It did not make her a legal equal. It was, at best, a crack in the wall. But it was a crack. And cracks, once they appear, tend to grow. 12 years later, in 1882, a second Married Women's Property Act was passed, and this one was significantly more powerful. It gave married women the right to own, buy, and sell property in their own names. It gave them the right to keep their own earnings, all of them, without limit. It gave them the right to enter into contracts. It gave them, for the first time in English legal history, a legal identity separate from their husbands. The doctrine of coverture, that ancient principle that a married woman's legal existence was suspended, was not formally abolished by the 1882 Act. It lingered in corners of the law for decades longer, but its practical force was broken. A married woman was no longer, in the most important sense, invisible. I want to be careful not to overstate the significance of this. Laws on paper and lives in practice are not the same thing. The 1882 Act did not end domestic violence. It did not end the double standard. It did not make society suddenly begin treating women's reputations with the same care and forgiveness it extended to men's. The whisper machine still ran. The drawing room still judged. The press still printed what it chose and protected whom it chose. But the ground had shifted. Slowly, unevenly, imperfectly, the ground had shifted. And something else was happening. Something harder to legislate, harder to measure, but perhaps even more important than any change in the law. Women were beginning to imagine different lives for themselves. In the 1880s and 1890s, a new figure appeared in British culture. She was called the New Woman, and she was to the Victorian establishment absolutely terrifying. The New Woman rode a bicycle. This sounds trivial to us now, but in the 1890s the bicycle was revolutionary technology for women. It gave them mobility. It gave them independence. It gave them the ability to go where they wanted, when they wanted, without a chaperone, without a carriage, without anyone's permission. The bicycle was freedom with 2 wheels and a bell. Susan B. Anthony, the American suffragist, said that the bicycle had done more to emancipate women than anything else in the world. And while that may be an exaggeration, it captures something real. Before the bicycle, a woman who wanted to go somewhere needed permission. She needed a companion. She needed a reason that would satisfy the people watching her. After the bicycle, she just needed to pedal. The image of a woman on a bicycle, hair slightly loosened by the wind, moving under her own power through streets she had previously only seen from the window of a carriage, became one of the defining images of the 1890s. It was painted, it was photographed, it was satirized in cartoons, it was debated in newspapers. Doctors wrote solemn papers about whether cycling was medically dangerous for women. Clergymen delivered sermons about whether it was morally appropriate. An entire society convulsed over the spectacle of a woman moving independently through public space. The anxiety was telling. It was never really about bicycles. It was about control, about the loss of it, about the slowly dawning recognition that the walls of the cage, those carefully constructed walls of law and custom and social expectation, were developing cracks that no amount of moral authority could repair. The New Woman attended university. Women had been admitted to some universities from the 1870s onward, though they were not always granted degrees, and they were often taught separately from men. But they were there. They were reading. They were thinking. They were developing the intellectual tools to understand and articulate the systems that had constrained them. The debates around women's education were, in retrospect, some of the most revealing conversations of the entire Victorian period. Serious, educated, intelligent men argued, with perfect sincerity, that education was physically dangerous for women, that the effort of sustained intellectual work would damage a woman's reproductive capacity, that the female brain was not designed for rigorous thought, and would, if subjected to it, break down. Dr. Henry Maudsley, one of the most respected psychiatrists in England, published an article in 1874 arguing that higher education would cause women to develop nervous disorders, physical weakness, and what he delicately called derangement of the reproductive functions. He was not a fringe figure, he was mainstream. His views were widely shared and widely cited, and yet, year after year, women entered the universities and did not break down. They studied Latin and Greek and mathematics and science and philosophy, and their reproductive systems remained, as far as anyone could tell, entirely intact. They sat examinations and performed brilliantly, sometimes outperforming the men who were supposed to be their intellectual superiors. In 1890, a young woman named Philippa Fawcett, the daughter of the suffragist Millicent Fawcett, sat the Cambridge Mathematical Tripos examination. She scored higher than the top-ranked male student. She was technically the best mathematician in her year at Cambridge University. She was not awarded a degree. Cambridge did not grant degrees to women until 1948, but her result was announced publicly, and the announcement sent a quiet shockwave through the academic establishment. Here was proof, undeniable mathematical proof, that a woman could not only match a man intellectually but surpass him, and the system that had insisted this was impossible had to find a way to absorb that fact without changing its fundamental assumptions. It managed, as systems usually do, by ignoring the inconvenient evidence and carrying on. The new woman wore rational dress. Instead of the corsets and crinolines and layers of restrictive fabric that Victorian fashion demanded, she wore simpler clothing that allowed her to move, to breathe, to exist in her body as something other than a decorative object. This was not merely a fashion choice, it was a statement. It said, "My body belongs to me, and I will dress it for my convenience, not for your pleasure." The new woman lived independently. Some of them took jobs as teachers, as nurses, as journalists, as typists in the new offices that were springing up across London. Some of them lived in boarding houses, in small flats, in rooms of their own. They had keys to their own front doors. They came and went as they pleased. And the new woman, most alarmingly of all, had opinions. She had opinions about politics. She had opinions about marriage. She had opinions about the law, about economics, about the empire, about religion, about all the subjects that had been, for so long, reserved for the male sphere. The reaction was predictable. The press mocked her. Cartoonists drew her as mannish, ugly, ridiculous. She was accused of being unnatural, unfeminine, a threat to the social order. She was told that her independence would make her unhappy, that her education would make her unmarriageable, that her opinions would make her lonely. The arguments were familiar. They were the same arguments that had been used against Caroline Norton, against Josephine Butler, against every woman who had ever stepped outside the boundary that society had drawn around her. You will be punished. You will be alone. You will be destroyed. But something was different this time. There were more of them. Not just one woman, not just a handful of exceptional individuals fighting against the tide alone. There were hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands of women who were looking at the angel in the house and saying clearly and without apology that they did not want to be angels, they wanted to be people. The women's suffrage movement, which had been building quietly since the 1860s, began to gain momentum. In 1866, a petition for women's suffrage was presented to Parliament by John Stuart Mill, the philosopher and Member of Parliament who had argued, with devastating clarity, that the subjection of women was not a natural law, but a social arrangement, maintained by custom and enforced by power. His book, The Subjection of Women, published in 1869, laid out the argument with a logical rigour that was almost impossible to refute, though many tried. The National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies was founded in 1897 under the leadership of Millicent Fawcett. Their arguments were calm, reasoned, and devastatingly logical. If women were moral beings, as everyone agreed they were, if women were capable of rational thought, as their achievements in education and literature and public life were beginning to demonstrate, then on what possible grounds could they be denied the right to participate in the governance of the society they lived in? The answers, when they came, were revealing. Women were too emotional. Women were too easily influenced. Women did not understand politics. Women's place was in the home. The same arguments, recycled, repackaged, offered with the same confident authority by men who genuinely believed them. But the ground was shifting. You could feel it. The old certainties were beginning to crack. And here is something I want to share with you, because I think it adds an important layer to everything we've been discussing tonight. There were moments, rare but significant, when the scandal machine turned its gears against a man, when even the protected class discovered that the rules, in extreme circumstances, could apply to them too. In 1890, Charles Stewart Parnell, the most powerful political leader in Ireland, a man who had built a movement, who had changed the direction of British politics, who was within reach of achieving Home Rule for Ireland, was destroyed by a scandal. His crime was an affair with Catherine O'Shea, the wife of one of his own party members. The affair had lasted nearly a decade. It was an open secret in political circles. But when Captain O'Shea filed for divorce and named Parnell as the other man, the public revelation tore apart everything Parnell had built. His party split. The Catholic Church condemned him. His political allies abandoned him. His health collapsed. He died the following year, in 1891, at the age of 45. Parnell's destruction was real, and it was swift, and it was total. But notice the circumstances. Parnell was not destroyed simply for having an affair. Many men of his standing had affairs and suffered nothing. Parnell was destroyed because the affair became politically useful to his enemies. It was weaponized, not because of its moral content, but because of its political utility. The scandal machine was turned against him, not out of moral outrage, but out of strategic calculation. Even in his destruction, the rules were different. A woman would have been destroyed simply for being accused. A man had to be politically inconvenient before the machine took notice. And then there was Oscar Wilde. I want to talk about Wilde because his case illustrates something profoundly important about the scandal system. He was a man who was destroyed by scandal, completely, irrevocably destroyed. And the nature of his destruction tells us something crucial about what the system was really protecting. Oscar Wilde was, in the early 1890s, the most celebrated playwright in London. The importance of being earnest, an ideal husband, Lady Windermere's fan, these were the hits of the West End. Wilde was witty, famous, brilliant, and deeply, recklessly careless about his private life. He was also, in a society that had criminalized it, homosexual. In 1895, the Marquis of Queensberry, the father of Wilde's lover Lord Alfred Douglas, left a card at Wilde's club accusing him of posing as a sodomite, a misspelling that has become one of the most famous in history. Wilde, against the advice of almost everyone who cared about him, sued for libel. The libel trial collapsed when Queensberry's lawyers produced evidence of Wilde's relationships with young men. Wilde withdrew the case, and then, with a speed that was breathtaking, the system that had celebrated him turned on him. He was arrested. He was tried for gross indecency. He was convicted. He was sentenced to 2 years of hard labour. He served the full sentence in conditions that broke his health permanently. He emerged from prison in 1897, bankrupt, broken, exiled. He lived out his remaining 3 years in France, under an assumed name, in poverty and isolation. He died in Paris in 1900. He was 46 years old. Now. Why was Oscar Wilde destroyed when Byron was celebrated? Why was Wilde's transgression punished when so many other transgressions were forgiven, ignored, or even admired? The answer, I think, is revealing. Byron's transgressions, however extreme, stayed within the boundaries of heterosexual masculinity. His affairs with women, even the rumoured incest with his half-sister, confirmed him as a man, a dangerous man, a reckless man, a morally questionable man, but a man nonetheless. His transgressions reinforced in a dark and twisted way the power structure that the system was designed to protect. Wheely's transgression was different. It didn't just break a rule, it challenged the category. It said that masculinity itself was not what the system claimed it was, and that was something the system could not tolerate. Not from anyone, not even from the most brilliant, most celebrated, most publicly adored man in London. The scandal machine, which had protected men and destroyed women for generations, was, at its core, a machine for enforcing categories, man and woman, masculine and feminine, public and private, respectable and fallen. As long as you stayed within your category, the machine would protect you or punish you according to which category you belonged to. But step outside the categories themselves, challenge the framework, suggest that the categories might not be natural or inevitable, or divinely ordained, and the machine would destroy you regardless of your gender. That is, I think, the deepest lesson of Oscar Wilde's story, and it connects, in a way that might not be immediately obvious, to everything we've been exploring tonight about women and scandal, because the women who were destroyed, Caroline Norton, Lady Caroline Lamb, Harriet Mordaunt, all of them, they were destroyed not simply for what they did, but for what they represented. They represented the possibility that a woman might not be an angel, that she might be a full, complex, desiring, ambitious, imperfect human being, and that possibility, like Wilde's challenge to the categories of sexuality, was something the system could not afford to tolerate. The system punished transgression, but it punished the transgression of categories most of all. As the century drew toward its end, the cracks were spreading. The Married Women's Property Act had given women legal identity. The reform of divorce law had given them, at least in theory, a path out of impossible marriages. The expansion of education had given them intellectual tools. The new woman had given them a model, flawed and incomplete, but real, of what a different kind of life might look like. And the suffrage movement was growing, not quietly anymore, not politely. The women who would become the suffragettes were beginning to emerge, and they were not interested in gentle persuasion. They were interested in results. But that is a story for another evening. Tonight, we have travelled far enough. The Victorian age was ending. Queen Victoria herself would die in January 1901, closing a chapter that had lasted 63 years. And the world that followed, the Edwardian world, the world of the early 20th century, would be different. Not completely, not perfectly, not in all the ways that it needed to be, but different. The double standard did not die with Victoria. It would take another century and more to dismantle, and there are those who would argue, with considerable justification, that it has not been fully dismantled yet. That the echoes of the system we've been exploring tonight can still be heard, in different forms, in different contexts, in the way stories are told, in the way blame is assigned, in the way certain people are forgiven and certain people are not. But the turning had begun. The women who refused to disappear had seen to that. Caroline Norton with her pamphlets, Josephine Butler with her courage, George Eliot with her novels, Florence Nightingale with her strategy, the new women with their bicycles and their opinions and their keys to their own front doors. They had all, in their different ways, looked at the machine and said, "This is not natural. This is not inevitable. This is a thing that was made, and it can be unmade, and slowly, unevenly, painfully, imperfectly, it began to be unmade. The clock in this room has wound down. I don't think we noticed when it stopped. The rain has eased to almost nothing, just the occasional tap of a drop against the glass, like a gentle reminder that the world outside still exists. The embers are dark now. The warmth remains, but it's the warmth of memory, the residual heat of a fire that burned well and served its purpose. We have one more room to visit tonight, one more quiet space, the room where we sit with what we've learned and feel the weight of it, and let it settle. That room is waiting, and it's very close. Come in, sit down. The chair is comfortable, the kind of chair that seems to know the shape of you, that gives in all the right places, that holds you without gripping, the kind of chair you sink into and immediately feel the weight of the evening begin to lift from your shoulders. The room is quiet, not silent, not entirely, because no room is ever truly silent. There is always something. The faint creak of a house settling, the soft sound of your own breathing, the distant, barely audible hum of a world that continues even when you are still. But it is quiet enough to think, quiet enough to feel, quiet enough to let the stories we've heard tonight settle the way sediment settles at the bottom of a clear glass of water, slowly, gently, finding their resting place. We have travelled a long way tonight, you and I. We started on a London street, in the fog, watching the lamplighter make his way along the pavement. We stepped into a drawing room where a quiet conversation was happening about someone who wasn't there. We sat at a dining table where the cutlery was arranged in a specific order, and the women left the room when the meal was over. We met Caroline Norton. We watched her marriage fall apart, her children taken, her name dragged through the courts and the newspapers of a city that had once admired her. We watched her pick up a pen and fight back, and we watched the law change because of what she wrote, even though the change came too late to save her. We watched her hold her dying son in her arms, a boy of 9, in a house in Scotland, far from home. We met Lord Byron. We watched him move through the same city, through the same social world, breaking every rule that would have destroyed a woman, and emerging from each transgression more celebrated, more desired, more famous than before. We watched his wife leave him and be blamed for it. We watched Lady Caroline Lamb love him and be destroyed by it. We watched Augusta Lee carry the weight of a rumour for the rest of her life, while Byron carried it like a badge of honour. We stepped into the press rooms of Fleet Street, where the printing presses shuddered and clanked and turned private grief into public entertainment. We watched Harriet Mordaunt confined to an asylum for 36 years, while the Prince of Wales returned to his comfortable life. We watched Lady Colin Campbell rebuild herself slowly, painfully, from the wreckage of a trial that should never have defined her. We looked at the law. We looked at coverture, that quiet, devastating doctrine that said a married woman ceased to exist as a legal person. We looked at the divorce courts, where one standard applied to men and another to women. We looked at the property laws that said everything a woman earned or owned or inherited belonged to someone else the moment she signed a marriage register. We met George Eliot, who wrote some of the greatest novels in the English language and could not attend a dinner party because she'd chosen to live with the man she loved. We met Josephine Butler, who spent 16 years fighting a law that punished women for a disease transmitted by men. We met the Bronte sisters, hiding behind male names because the world would not take a woman's novel seriously. We watched the slow turning of the tide, the Married Women's Property Acts, the new woman on her bicycle, the suffrage movement gathering force, the cracks in the wall spreading slowly, unevenly, but spreading. And we watched Oscar Wilde, the brilliant, the reckless, the doomed, discover that the scandal machine could destroy a man too, but only when his transgression threatened not just a rule, but a category. That is a great deal of ground to have covered in a single evening, a great deal of history, a great deal of sorrow, a great deal of courage. That is the journey we have taken tonight. And I want to sit with it for a moment, here in this quiet room, before we let it go. Because I think there is something in all of this that goes beyond history, something that touches something deeper, something that is not just about Victorian England, but about the way human beings build systems and the way those systems shape the lives of the people who live inside them. The Victorians did not invent the double standard. It existed long before Victoria was born, and it persisted long after she died. But the Victorians refined it, they codified it, they built it into their laws, their customs, their literature, their architecture, their furniture, their table settings, their calling cards, their morning rituals, their evening prayers. They made it so complete, so pervasive, so woven into the fabric of daily life, that it became almost invisible, like the air, like gravity, like the ticking of a clock that you stop hearing because it has always been there. And the people who lived inside that system, most of them, most of the time, accepted it. Not because they were stupid, not because they were cruel, not because they lacked the capacity for empathy or imagination, but because the system told them it was natural. It told them it was God's design. It told them it was the way things had always been and would always be. And when a system tells you that often enough from enough different directions, with enough confident authority, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to see it for what it is. A choice, a human choice, made by people, maintained by people, and capable of being unmade by people. That is what Caroline Norton understood when she picked up her pen. That is what Josephine Butler understood when she stood in front of a hostile crowd and spoke about things that no respectable woman was supposed to know about. That is what George Eliot understood when she chose to live her life on her own terms, even knowing what it would cost her. They saw the system, they named it, and by naming it, they began to unmake it. The room we're sitting in now is not a Victorian drawing room. Not anymore. The gaslight has been replaced by something softer, something steadier. The heavy curtains have been drawn back just a little, and through the gap you can see the first suggestion of something that might, eventually, become morning. Not yet. Not for a long time yet. But the sky has changed. The deepest black has softened to something approaching dark blue. The faintest hint of grey along the horizon. The world turning, as it always turns, toward the light. And the rain has stopped. You might not have noticed exactly when. It tapered off so gently, so gradually, that the transition from rain to silence was seamless. But it has stopped. The windows are still wet, still streaked with the paths of old raindrops, and the street lamp outside, Whatever kind of lamp it is now catches those streaks and turns them into thin lines of gold. The room is warm, not the fierce, active warmth of a blazing fire, but the residual warmth that lingers after the fire has done its work. The warmth that has soaked into the walls, into the floorboards, into the cushion beneath you and the blanket across your lap. It is a warmth that asks nothing, it simply holds. I want to think for a moment about names. We have spoken so many names tonight. Caroline Norton, George Eliot, Josephine Butler, Lord Byron, Lady Caroline Lamb, Harriet Mordaunt, Augusta Lee, Annabella Milbank, Oscar Wilde, Florence Nightingale, Charlotte Bronte, Harriet Martineau. Each of those names was at some point a living person standing in a room not so different from this one. Each of them breathed and ate and slept and loved and was afraid and hoped for something and lost something and wondered in the quiet hours whether it had all been worth it. History has a way of turning people into stories, into examples, into lessons. We use them to illustrate points. We arrange them in patterns. We make them mean things. But before they were stories, they were people, and I think it is worth remembering that. Caroline Norton was not a symbol of injustice. She was a woman who missed her children. George Eliot was not an example of female genius overcoming adversity. She was a person who loved someone and chose that love over the approval of the world and lived with the consequences every single day. Josephine Butler was not a historical reformer. She was a mother who lost her daughter and went looking for a way to make the grief mean something. These are not lessons, they are lives. And I think there is something important in letting them be lives, in letting them be messy and complicated and full of contradictions, rather than smoothing them into neat moral shapes. The chair you're sitting in is very comfortable. Have you noticed how comfortable it is? The kind of chair that makes you aware of your own weight, not as a burden but as a fact. You are here. You have substance. You are settled. Your breathing has probably slowed. That happens when you've been listening for a long time, when the story has been carrying you forward and you haven't needed to do anything but be carried. The breath gets deeper. The shoulders drop. The jaw unclenches, the small muscles around the eyes relax. These are good things. Let them happen. I want to tell you one more thing. Not a story, not a fact. Just a thought that has been growing slowly, quietly, at the edge of everything we've discussed tonight, and that I think deserves to be spoken before we're done. The women we met tonight, the ones who were destroyed, and the ones who fought back, they all had one thing in common. They all lived in a world that told them a single story about who they were allowed to be. A narrow story, a rigid story, a story with very specific rules about what a woman could do and say and feel and want. And the bravest thing any of them did, braver than writing pamphlets, braver than speaking in public, braver than defying convention, was to imagine a different story. To look at the story they'd been given and say, this is not the only story. There are other ways to be. There are other ways to live. That act of imagination, that quiet, stubborn, world-changing act of imagining a life that the system says is impossible, that is, I think, one of the most powerful things a human being can do. And it is not something that belongs to the 19th century. It is something that belongs to every century, to every person who has ever looked at the rules they were given and thought, these rules were made by people, and people can make different rules. The sky outside has lightened another shade. Still dark, still deep. But the blue is deeper now, richer, the kind of blue that painters spend lifetimes trying to capture. The blue that exists only in the hour before dawn, when the world is balanced between night and morning, between the story that has been told and the story that is about to begin. The street lamp outside has dimmed, or perhaps it only seems that way because the sky's changing around it. Either way, the light is shifting. The shadows in the room are softer now. The edges of things are less sharp. The boundaries between one object and another are beginning to blur, the way boundaries always blur when you're tired and warm and safe and still. You're very comfortable. The story is done, not finished, because stories like this one are never really finished. They continue in different forms, in different places, in the lives of people who may never know the names we've spoken tonight, but who live in the world those names help to shape. But the telling is done. The names have been spoken. The drawing rooms have been visited. The laws have been examined. The newspapers have been read. The women have been met and mourned and admired and remembered. And now there is just this room, this chair, this warmth, this quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after a long conversation when everything important has been said and there is nothing left to do but sit together in the comfortable silence that only exists between people who have shared something real. I am glad you were here tonight. I am glad you stayed through all of it. Through the fog and the gaslight and the drawing rooms and the courtrooms and the printing presses and the laws and the lives. Through the anger and the sadness and the quiet devastation and the slow, stubborn, beautiful turning of the tide. You didn't need to stay, but you did, and that matters. It matters because these stories deserve to be heard, because Caroline Norton deserves to have someone listen to what happened to her, because Josephine Butler deserves to have someone remember what she fought for, because George Eliot deserves to have someone sit with the absurdity and the heartbreak of a world that would read her books but would not invite her to dinner. Their stories deserve your attention, and you gave it. Thank you for that. The room is very quiet now. The warmth has settled into something so steady, so even, so reliable, that you've stopped noticing it. It has become part of you. Part of the room, part of the night. Your eyelids are heavy. That's all right. They should be. You've been travelling for a long time tonight, through centuries, through drawing rooms, through courtrooms, through lives. That is tiring work. Good work, but tiring. And your body knows it. Your body is telling you in the gentlest possible way that it is time to rest. So rest. Let the names settle. Let them find their places in your memory, the way they found their places in history. Not neatly, not perfectly, but honestly, in all their messy, complicated human truth. Caroline Norton, writing at her desk. Josephine Butler, standing before a crowd. George Eliot, choosing love over approval. Florence Nightingale, building her fortress of respectability. The Bronte sisters, writing under names that were not their own. The unnamed women, resisting quietly, in private, in ways that were never recorded. They are all here, in this room, in the quiet, in the warmth, in the last fading light of an evening that has been, I hope, worth your time. The sky outside is lighter still, not dawn, not yet, but the promise of it. The knowledge that the darkness, however deep, however long, is not permanent, that the world turns, that the light returns, that things change, slowly, painfully, imperfectly, but they change. That is not a lesson, it's just a fact, a quiet, steady, reliable fact, like the warmth in this room, like the chair beneath you, like the sound of your own breathing. Breathe. The night is almost over. The story has been told. The women have been remembered. The tide has turned, and you are here, warm, safe, Still. Let the room hold you. Let the quiet hold you. Let the night, what remains of it, hold you the way a good story holds you, gently, firmly, without asking anything in return. Your eyes can close now. They've earned it. The rain may start again later, or it may not. It doesn't matter. What matters is this moment, this warmth, this stillness, this slow, steady, unhurried feeling of rest. The women of the 19th century did not have this. They did not have this quiet. They did not have this safety. They lived in a world that watched them constantly, that judged them relentlessly, that punished them for the simple fact of being human. But they found moments, quiet moments, stolen moments, in the hours before dawn or after the household had gone to sleep. Moments when they were not performing. Moments when the drawing room was empty, and the calling cards were put away, and the curtains were drawn, and they could be, just for a little while themselves. Those moments are what we've been sitting in tonight. The moments between the performance, the moments when the truth comes out, not loudly, not dramatically, but softly, in the quiet, in the warmth, in the dim golden light of a fire that has burned down to its last embers. You are in one of those moments now, and it is good, it is enough, it is exactly where you need to be. The last ember's gone dark. The room is held now only by the faintest light from the window, that deep pre-dawn blue that is neither night nor morning, neither the old story nor the new one, but the space between, the space where change lives, the space where rest lives, the space where the next day has not yet asked anything of you. Stay in that space for a while. There is no hurry. There is nowhere you need to be. No morning calls to make. No calling cards to leave. No reputations to protect. No rules to follow. Just this. Just the warmth. Just the quiet. Just the slow, steady rhythm of a world that is turning, gently, towards something new. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring about the women whose stories we told, and the men whose stories we examined, and the system we tried to understand, and the slow, painful, unfinished work of making the world a little more fair, a little more kind, a little more willing to see every person as fully, irreducibly, beautifully human. Sleep well. The world will be here when you wake, and it will be, in some small way, because of people like Carolyn Norton and Josephine Butler and George Eliot and all the others whose names we know and whose names we don't. A little bit better than it was before. The light outside is changing. The blue is deepening. The stars, if there were any, are fading. The city is still asleep, most of it, and the fog has lifted, and the streets are quiet, and the lamplighter will not come again tonight, because his work is done. And yours is done too. Close your eyes. Let the darkness be soft. Let the silence be warm. Let the stories find their resting places. You have listened well. You have travelled far. And now it is time to be still. Be still. The night will keep you, and the morning when it comes will be gentle. Good night.